Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is, again, the end of the book. We're going to finish the book, Masters of War, Latin America and U.S. Aggression from the Cuban Revolution through the Clinton years, a book by Clara Neto. And in this book, we describe the racist pimps and murderous butchers of the U.S. politicians and the U.S. Army in their vicious campaign of terror across Central and South America, or better known as Latin America. The issues or the countries that we spoke of yesterday included Panama and Cuba. So we're going to discuss Panama and Cuba for a short bit here. We discussed Panama yesterday. This was an illegal intervention and a criminal act of aggression by the murderous pimps and butchers of the U.S. government and their, U.S. Army and their U.S. politicians. The invasion of Panama was endorsed by the Congress. It was endorsed by the United States press, the racist press, and their, vicious campaign of terror. We discussed all of the different, issues in Panama, the OAS, the condemnations that were internationally given to Bush's criminal war of aggression, in which he covered up atrocities by the U.S. Army thugs. He covered up the murders. He said 87 people were killed in this invasion. There were thousands dead, as per the Attorney General of the United States when he visited, and he said everything that was fed from the Western media, the racist Western fraud press, the European fascist press and its U.S. counterparts, was all lies. It was all deliberate lies and fabrications. The racist whites of the West, again, deceiving the world in their vicious terror campaign for colonial oppression in Central America. So we're going to take a little, detour on the European press. The European press, including the British and the French press, the racist press of Britain and France, and the United States press, and their propaganda. Let's get it straight. The United States press is, the absolute bottom. It is a propagandist machine, but it gets its techniques and its thought control from the European fascist press of Britain and France. That includes basic news outlets like Guardian, like BBC, like Telegraph, all of these things coming from Britain. And then France, we have France 24 and all of their different media outlets. They are colonial fascist press. They report things in the terms and perspectives of the white racist colonialists that still lurk in the minds of Western, ideologists and Western, journalists. There's colonial feelings of wanting to enslave people from the third world, wanting to re-enslave the countries that they used to enslave. We remember the issues that they had in Vietnam, the racist war of aggression. We also know the racist wars they had in Africa and the South African apartheid, the colonial states that they did, what kinds of atrocities they committed. They still don't want to accept that they are racist pimps and murderers of colonialism. This was a murderous butcher campaign by the racist whites of the West, including the United States, Britain, and France. And it also included Dutch and Portugal. So I want to make clear that, the Western press is implicated in so many crimes against so many different leaders. Their action against, the Nicaraguan Sandinistas, they reported all of lies. They reported all lies that the Sandinistas were giving trouble. And then the French government stopped selling weapons, and it was a big deal. The U.S. press and Reagan, endorsed a, criminal war against the poor Nicaraguan people. They used terrorism with the Contras, the racist pimps and murderous butchers of the U.S. Congress and its, President Reagan. They did all of this in the name of, liberation of the Hispanic people of Nicaragua. Who is the white man to enslave and colonize and then say you are liberating the people? You are racist, self-serving, murderous butchers. So So the press is an important aspect. I wanted to just take a short just short discussion of the press, the United States press and the Western press, the U.S. press, mass media. Read the books by Noam Chomsky. All of his books on press fraud, necessary illusions, beyond hypocrisy. Manufacturing consent. All of these books discuss in depth the U.S. Gun violent, the violent orgy of racist murder that the Western governments use and cover up in their vicious campaigns to imperialize and colonize like vicious thugs. They're a group of mafia thugs of the U.S. government, the British government, and the French government. This is a criminal group of colonial murderers. They still have colonization, agendas in their head. It goes with their, recent invasions of Venezuela and Iran, their recent invasions and their cover-up, their Western cover-up of what happened in Venezuela. We don't even know what's happening because the Western press doesn't tell a damn thing. The racist, murderous butchers of the U.S. government imperialize, use their Western press to hide the facts. And even if it's called criminal, what does it matter? They've, enslaved the people once they go there. Their vicious army, rapists, pimps, and murderers that, go to the lands of, Venezuela and, enslave the people. So we have to understand, very important. So let's, go back to Panama, just a couple, more comments. So the British criminal war of aggression in Panama was a bloodbath. It was a bloodbath. He, broke all international rules. He was condemned at all international organizations. We discussed the Torrijos-Carter Treaty, the basis for which he went in. He didn't go in to remove Noriega or for drug trafficking. There was a treaty signed by Torrijos and Carter that were in favor of the Panamanian government and Panamanian sovereignty over the Panama Canal in 1991. He needed to, remove that treaty. He needed to annul that treaty. And so he needed to put his own, fascist group of colonial thugs in the government, and he did so. He put Arias and Endara in the government so that they could, rule with an iron fist and remove any semblance of democracy and Panamanian sovereignty over their canal. We remember Theodore Roosevelt's, racist clause and imperialist murderous butchery in the Panama Canal. So the U.S. Justice Department fabricated all the charges. There was thousands of civilians killed. There were, rape. There was rampant rape by U.S. Army, thugs. They're rapist thugs of the U.S. Army, and they're, criminal politicians. They're, thug politicians, pimps of the U.S. Senate and, Congress. They, created this, enormous casualty in Central America for their colonial campaign of butchery. So we also discussed all the OAS condemned the invasion. The U.S. had to, do a lot of political maneuvering against the OAS to make them to tone down their statement. But their statement was basically that we condemn the invasion by the United States, war of aggression against Panama, and we were requesting immediate withdrawal of its troops from Panama. That was the ultimate statement that the countries of Uruguay, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Chile, Nicaragua, and Cuba put together in the OAS, during the campaign. So that basically that's the first topic. The second topic we discussed. The second topic we discussed, was basically the Cuba. So we discussed, the whole Castro-Reagan, war of aggression, the war between these two countries, and basically the hardened stance by the United States after Reagan came into power to Cuba. Basically Reagan was a, butcher. He was a criminal, murderous butcher, a racist butcher. He attacked small countries in Central America and expected Cuba to remain silent. The vicious anti-Hispanic butcher thugs of the U.S. government, Ronald Reagan, and its U.S. Congress. They are anti-Hispanic, butcher racists, super racist butchers of Hispanics by the U.S. gun violent thugs. So that was that. And then we talked about Gorbachev, and, we finished with Bush's invasion of Iraq and how Castro, called it a flagrant violation of, colonial intervention and oil theft by the U.S., murderous butchers, the white murderers, racist butchers of the United States of America. So remember, the Google Drive link will be in the description section. Please download it. I'm going to start, with a little background. The Panama invasion by the United States was called an attempt at prosecuting Noriega. It was in reality a violent coup by the United States to modify the terms of the Torrijos-Carter Treaty, signed regarding the Panama Canal between Torrijos and Carter. The treaty gave rights to Panama starting in 1991 that allowed Panama complete sovereignty of the canal, and Washington needed to put a fraud fascist in power to modify the treaty so that the United States could maintain its control over Panama and threaten the rest of Latin America with American violent hegemony, as well as violent colonialism. There was no real evidence against Noriega, and the U.S. Justice Department fabricated charges, and Noriega was charged only because he would not agree to attacking the sandinistas in Nicaragua or changing the terms of the Torrijos-Carter Treaty. For that, Washington needs someone who would do their murderous bidding. The invasion of Panama was associated with mass murder of civilians, which Bush never admitted to, and several thousands were killed in this bombing and vicious campaign of racist aggression against Panama. In addition, the international outcry was enormous. Various countries took center stage to condemn the United States government butchers for this act of criminal aggression against Panama. These included large Latin American countries, including Uruguay, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Chile, Nicaragua, and Cuba. An important statement was made by Peru and the OAS representative. The Peruvian OAS representative, who called the invasion an outrageous insult to Latin America and an episode that shamefully reflects the region's past, and Ecuador's representative called it a flagrant violation of international law without any justification whatsoever. Uruguay rejected United States military measures, and Chile condemned the intervention no matter the reasons that were used by Washington to justify it. The OAS also condemned the United States military intervention and demanded the immediate withdrawal of the invading troops. The U.S. put a puppet fraud government, not the democratic government that was elected, but a fascist group of Endara, Arias, and Ford, who could easily be manipulated with respect to the Torrijos-Carter Treaty. The U.S. public and government elated and cheered over the mass murder and orgy of violence against Hispanics in Panama. We should remember the European fascist racists of the Western media and their vicious campaigns to discredit Noriega to win justification for Bush's criminal war of aggression and mass murder against the people of Panama. Again, we remind viewers to be very careful about listening to Western media outlets, especially when they have a conflict with non-Europeans, as they become pro-white fascist liars, cheats, and con artist propagandists. The responsibility for the invasion rested on the democratic institutions and leaders of the civic crusade, financed and led by Washington, for declining to come to an agreement that would have permitted a transition to a democratic solution, a government elected by the people. The cost of their quote-unquote presidency was the invasion. The U.S. would, of course, not allow any third world country to have a government elected by the people, since they are white, colonialist, anti-third world, fascist propagandists, and murderous butchers. Now we turn to Cuba. Reagan was elected to the White House in 1981 and became obsessed with Cuban communism and whipped up hysteria. He whipped up major destabilization of Castro's government using Cuban exiles, propaganda radio stations, broadcasting Cuba, asking the people to overthrow the government and replace it with a dictatorship, and included references to Marty and Batista in his propaganda. This was offensive to the Cuban people, as Batista was an American murderous, racist tyrant of the American white butchers who severely repressed his people and committed napalm bombings of civilians. Castro removed Reagan's propaganda radio from the air in Cuba. Reagan's radio failure was described as a mouse by the Cuban people, laughed at its similarity to the Bay of Pigs failure at Playa Girón, a Playa Girón of the air. Reagan was much more effective against Cuba than would be expected. He relied on the Southern Cone dictatorships of Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina to form a political force at the OAS, the scrap organization of American states that the U.S. violent murderous butchers never follow, and whipped up hysteria against Cuba, refusing to maintain relations. Severed diplomatic ties with Southern Cone colonial dictatorships were frequent with Cuba. General Torrijos, the signer of the Torrijos-Carter Agreement, was killed in a mysterious airplane accident for which the United States may have been responsible. Subsequently, the coup against President Arroyo, who was forced to resign by rightist military officers in Panama, and aligned itself then with Washington as a military murderous dictatorship and hardened its Cuban policies. Jamaica also had a conservative leader elected to power, Edward Seaga, who was a violent anti-Cuban and anti-communist individual. He severed relations with Cuba. Castro, at the meeting of the Interparliamentary Union in Havana in 1981, called the Reagan administration fascist and noted it was covered with the blood of three continents, a warmonger and satanic that pushes the policies of war, and intervened in El Salvador with a murder colony where the American government, violent murderous butchers, murdered 20,000 people. Attacking small countries reflects the American cowardice and failed strategy, as they continue to do to this day. Gorbachev and perestroika caused major alarm in Cuba as the Soviet empire crumbled in front of Castro, but he maintained his stance that he will continue the struggle for nationalism and sovereignty for the Third World. Economic aid for Gorbachev was failed since the West was verbally supported but financially cheap. We finished with Bush's invasion in Iraq, in which Castro called a flagrant violation of international law and a colossal political mistake, which it ended up happening to be. So in summary, the American government, white mass murdering butchers, conducted a campaign of anti-communist hysteria against Cuba, including threats of forced subversion and human rights con artist propaganda and condemnation at the OAS. So let's get started. Let's we're started with our description. Remember, we're going to be finishing the book today, so just bear with us. It's going to take it'll take about 3 hours. So Reagan in his nightmare. The level of public insults between Washington and the Havana government. No, sorry, I just made a mistake. Let's start here. Requiem for the Soviet Union. A few olive branches could not wipe out more than 70 years of Marxist-Leninist doctrine, the epicenter of communism, notable scientific and cultural triumph. The initiator of the conquest of space, the first satellite, and the first cosmonaut were Soviet, the second greatest world superpower, and its anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist banners, which kept alive the Soviet people's consciousness of the political and military rivalries, contradictions, and antagonisms with the United States, its greatest enemy. The Soviet Union fell apart. Such was the legacy of glasnost and perestroika. In the 4 years of the tortuous perestroika process, the chaotic political scene was shaken by the struggle for power between Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin, full of their mutual aversion, in which the stability and future of the communist superpower were at stake. In August 1991, a coup against Gorbachev, he was arrested and held in his dacha in Foros, Crimea, by order of the self-appointed state emergency committee presided over the Prime Minister Gennady Yakovlev and composed of the highest government officials. Yeltsin was opposed to the coup and defended the constitutional process. His enormous figure on a truck surrounded by people with Soviet flags gave the world a shock. Yeltsin led the defense of constitutionality. His prestige within and outside the country grew like wildfire. The Cuban leadership received word of Moscow's coup as they were celebrating the conclusion of the successful 11th Pan American Games. Havana was in a party mood since its athletes had just won 140 gold medals and the people were applauding their commandant. In a statement published in the Daily Granma on August 21st, the government expressed its deep concern, warned of the incalculable consequences that there might be for the Soviet people and the rest of the world from any internal conflict in this multinational country endowed with powerful nuclear arms, and gave voice to its fervent desire that this great country should be able to overcome its difficulties of peace, remain unified, and exercise the international influence it earned as an indispensable counterweight to those who wanted to apply an absolute and hegemonic colonial dominance in the world. The statement went on, Yankee imperialism, the international policeman that aspires to own the world and has no right to take advantage of this unhappy situation. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but Yeltsin was the hero. The ridiculous episode was over, but the chemistry of the country was changed for good. A flood of resignations, arrests, firings, and suicides by those who had supported the coup began at once. The KGB secret police was dismantled. Yeltsin ordered its archives sealed, as well as of the internal ministry and the military. And the CPSU was in agony as the result of mass desertions and paralysis. Its activities were prohibited. Its headquarters were closed or confiscated by government of localities and republics. The archives were sealed to prevent the destruction of documents. Its newspapers were closed, and a good number of prominent members were accused and brought up on charges of corruption. Gorbachev's resignation from the post of Secretary General of the CPSU, which was urged by Yeltsin, and the resignation of the rest of the party's leadership at Gorbachev's request, were the coup de grace. The CPSU, the Soviet regime's backbone, ceased to exist. The people's euphoric at the disappearance of the dictatorship, quote unquote, party started to tear down the statues of Lenin, the venerable author of the Bolshevik Revolution, creator of the first communist nation in the world, father of the fatherland, and glory of the Soviet Republic. These acts of vandalism occurred throughout the country. Castro called the events inconceivable. They were, he remarked, a lust to destroy the history of the country, deny its values and merits. They ignored the contributions of socialism and the Marxist-Leninist ideas that have given birth to the October Revolution, one of the greatest events of the century, and denied its leadership of the worldwide struggle of the workers' movement and the societal gains made in wages and in every other area. It ignored the greatest influence in international affairs, such as the defeat of fascism, the liberation movements in the former colonies, the disappearances of colonialism, and the liberation struggle of the peoples of all continents. Socialism, he emphasized, had converted the Soviet Union, a poor and backward country, into the second largest world power. He pointed out the social, military, and scientific achievements, the conquest of space, and its contributions to world culture. The consequences of the August coup were devastating. One after another, the Soviet republics proclaimed independence. Yeltsin administered the death blow to Soviet unity on December 8, 1991, when, as president of Russia, he signed the Commonwealth of Independent States Treaty, CIS, and the presidents of the Ukraine and Belarus republics. Gorbachev denounced the treaty as illegal and dangerous. His own proposal to create a union of sovereign socialist republics led by the Kremlin was tossed in the trash. Gorbachev warned that the Soviet Congress had to ratify this treaty, and he tried to convene it, but the Russian parliament ratified it 188-6, and at the same time annulled the 1922 treaty that had first formed the Soviet Union. The Soviet Congress decided not to convene. The dismantling of the Soviet state, a cruel and pathetic process, left Gorbachev with nothing to do, without power and without a country. Yeltsin, as president of powerful Russia, nationalized the enormous resources of this immense nation, suspended the Russian contribution to the support of the Soviet government, and issued decrees to put national institutions under Russian control, including 8 ministries of the state that could no longer maintain for lack of funds. He took possession of the Kremlin, the president's office, and changed the locks so that Gorbachev would be unable to gain access. The ministries of foreign relations and interior, the KGB and Congress, and all the cash funds of the central government. Analysts called this move another coup d'etat against Gorbachev. Yeltsin left the Ministry of Defense and the Atomic Power Agency under the control of the Supreme Soviet. On December 23rd, at the CIS spread to Muslim republics. It was now composed of 10 or 15 of the 15 republics. The 3 Baltic states, Georgia and Azerbaijan, maintained the complete independence. The CIS, the Soviet Union, with Russia at the head, and Boris Yeltsin were leading Russia with his thumb on the nuclear button. Russia took the place of the Soviet Union in the United Nations Security Council, including the right to a veto, and the former Soviet republics joined the World Organization as independent states. On December 25th, Christmas in the Christian world, the red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin dome, and the Russian tricolor was raised. With this ceremony broadcast to the world on CNN, the Soviet Union disappeared from the planet. The following day, Gorbachev, pressured by Yeltsin, resigned in a modest ceremony. Yeltsin did not attend because Gorbachev's farewell speech was not to his liking. From the White House on the other side of the Atlantic, President Bush announced to the nations and to the world this extraordinary development. In a gesture of triumph, he thanked the people of the United States for their help to bring down the Soviet Empire and the communist world in ending the Cold War, in the triumph of the West, the free world, democracy, the United States, and though he did not say so, his own. The State of the Union address to Congress in January 1992 was a declaration of victory. Congress reverberated with applause. The world superpower disappeared. It became a series of independent nations divided by borders, conflicts, rivalries, and suspicions, with broken economies and enormous domestic problems, some of them with civil wars and fierce struggles for power and wealth, the discrete charm of capitalism entering the mendicant, underdeveloped world. With what Castro had foreseen and feared came to pass, Castro described as the Soviet collapse as an incredible case of self-destruction for which he blamed its leaders. Everything they did, he declared, led to its destruction, the phenomenon and tendencies they unleashed to it. We saw it from the beginning, or very close to the beginning. He remarked that although Gorbachev had not wanted the dissolution of the Soviet Union, he was trying to improve socialism. He bore the major responsibility for these events. Imperialism could not have destroyed the Soviet Union if the Soviets had not destroyed it first, declared Castro. He added that the United States and its allies had helped to destroy socialism and the Soviet Union by egging on the reactionary forces there. In the West, he added, even the terminology was changed so that those who wanted to defend the Soviet Union, socialism, and communism could be termed conservatives, and those who wanted capitalism and even the disappearance of the Soviet Union could be called progressive and leftist forces. All these concepts have deliberately been turned inside out. Western propaganda encouraged this process because the West wanted to force the Soviet Union to its knees. Imperialism did all this, and now it was afraid of what might happen and the possible consequences of this disintegration, he noted. The world followed the fall of the Soviet Union colossus with fascination, but also with great concern. Its disappearance meant the end of the East-West military standoff, the so-called Cold War, but it also meant the end of a two-power world. The United States remained standing to dominate the world, with Bush at its helm, preaching the New World Order without bothering to explain what that was. A lone superpower throws the world off balance. It creates the conditions for the hegemony of one single country. It is the worst thing that can happen to the world, declared Castro in an interview with ABC television news anchor Diane Sawyer in Havana in February 1993. He added the hegemonic superpower will not be able to control the world's problems with artillery fire. Blows from the empire. Ronald Reagan's departure from the White House in January 1989 was a relief for Cuba. The new head of state, George Bush, and his much hyped pragmatism hinted at a favorable change. But he turned out to be worse than Reagan. He turned the economic, commercial, and financial embargo of Cuba into a worldwide blockade, sharpened the psychological warfare, and continued the frenetic military maneuvers in the Caribbean, whose message was a threat to invade the island. In May 1990, Ocean Venture and Solid Shield were carried out simultaneously. The military also carried out exercises at Guantanamo. Bush was convinced that the winds of perestroika would come to Cuba, and with this help, the Cuban regime would fall apart and he would get to watch Castro's head roll. In response to Solid Shield, Cuba carried out its own military maneuvers called Cuban Shield and the deployment of fighter aircraft, a concentration of troops surrounding Guantanamo, and the mobilization of the reserves. If the United States invaded Cuba, warned Castro, rivers of blood would flow. Bush maintained his campaign of denigrating Cuba, and Castro continued the vendetta accusations of violations of human rights with even greater determination, imposed greater restrictions on United States citizens traveling to the island and on Cubans entering the United States, extending them even to members of Cuba's government. In an annual speech on July 26, 1989, at Camagüey, Castro announced Bush's aggressive acts. Never, he declared, has a United States government, not even Ronald Reagan's, exhibited so triumphalistic an attitude. Never has the United States been so threatening as now. He attributed this United States euphoria to Bush's conviction that socialism was on death's bed. Christ turns his back. The eruption of the worst scandal in the history of the Cuban Revolution on June 14, 1989, shook the country down to its foundations. The cast of the scandal was composed of elite officers of the armed forces and the Ministry of the Interior. A sobering statement made by the Ministry of the Revolutionary Armed Forces, headed by Raul Castro, the second most powerful person in the Cuban hierarchy, published in Granma, stated it was fulfilling its unpleasant duty of reporting the arrest of Divisional General Arnoldo Ochoa Sanchez, accused of serious acts of corruption. Whatever the merits of any comrade may have been, it added, the party and the Revolutionary Armed Forces could not allow impunity to those who, putting aside the principles of the revolution, commit serious transgressions against morality and the socialist laws. 2 days later, the long editorial in Granma reported the arrest of Brigadier General Patricio de la Guardia Font, his twin brother, Colonel Antonio de la Guardia Front, Ochoa's assistants, Captain Jorge Martinez Valdez, an official of the Ministry of the Interior, Major Amado Padron Trujillo, and other military officers of lower rank, including one woman, who were all accused of drug trafficking, illicit enrichment, and corruption. The investigation, the paper reported, found no evidence that the arrested officers were involved in any counter-revolutionary activity. It added, the inexorable weight of justice will fall on them. At that point, no connection had been made between Ochoa's arrest and that of the LaGuardia brothers. The arrest of General Ochoa was a scandal in itself. Time compared what might have happened in the United States if General Dwight Eisenhower had been arrested. Ochoa was a hero of the Republic of Cuba, a rare honor for his outstanding performance in international missions. Venezuela, he mentioned for the first time in this context, as a commander of the victorious Cuban troops in Ethiopia and Angola. Ochoa was a former fighter in the Sierra Maestra, a member of the Central Committee, and a deputy to the National Assembly, expected by the military hierarchy and admired by the people. He was a friend to Fidel and Raul. Ochoa was accused of corruption, smuggling marbled diamonds and precious woods, and dealing on the black market. Colonel Tony de la Guardia, a special super agent, was respected and enjoyed the friendship of Fidel and Raul. As director of the MC department responsible for the highly secret commercial operations that allowed Cuba to thumb its nose at the United States embargo, he traveled freely and carried out business deals of all kinds with very little or no supervision. In May, he was dismissed from the MC Directorate. Around the same time, Diocles Torralba, Minister of Transportation and Vice President of the Council of Ministers, was also arrested with immoral, dissipated, and corrupt conduct. In Dolce Vista, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Granma claimed that this arrest had nothing to do with Ochoa's, which it described as much more serious and complex. Later, General Jose Abrantes, the Minister of the Interior, was dismissed and then arrested with 3 officials from the ministry and sentenced to 20 years in prison, where he died of a heart attack in January 1991. Within less than 24 hours, the closest circle of officers, connected by family ties, friendship, and common experiences, comes crashing down. They were the officers closest to Castro. Cuba had opened Pandora's box without knowing the consequences. We knew the problem was not a simple one. We knew what happens when a person of this kind must be arrested and tried. We know what sort of campaign would be unleashed against us, Castro declared. He decided to face the facts without imagining what might be coming. The investigation that led to the arrest of the 14 officers and testimony in their trials confirmed their activities in the drug traffic and brought to light the involvement of Pablo Escobar, the head of the Medellin cartel and the drug trafficker most wanted by the Colombian and the United States authorities. The connection with Escobar was through Captain Martinez Valdez, Ochoa's assistant, who traveled clandestinely to Colombia using false Colombian passport. Martinez testified at the trial that Escobar was not interested in money laundering, but in being able to count on Cuban airport laboratories and other things. These other things were 10 ground-to-air rocket launchers the airplane kept in readiness for him, and the construction of a cocaine processing factory. Major Amado Padron argued that these things, quote unquote, were not possible in Cuba. Between January 1987 and April 1989, there were 19 operations, 15 of them successful. 6 tons of cocaine were smuggled into the United States at a profit of $3.4 million. The airplanes took off from Colombia and landed at a military airfield in Varadero. From these, the drugs were transported to the Florida Keys in fast boats under the command of Mariletos, Cubans who had emigrated to the United States in the Mariel Exodus of 1980. In negotiations with the Colombian and Mexican capos, the Cuban officers act as envoys of their government without revealing the identity of their bosses, quote unquote. The ambiguity compromised the Cuban government and Fidel and Raul Castro personally. The scandal was devastating for Cuba and the importance of the officers implicated in the fact that since the beginning of the 1980s, Castro had repeatedly, roundly, and vigorously rejected as calumnies the United States accusation that Cuban government officials were involved in drug trafficking. He called these charges infamous propaganda, riddled with falsehood and lies, and described the United States as a nation in decadence, incapable of overcoming the internal consumption of stupefactants. Our first reaction, since we have become accustomed to the hearing of all sorts of lies, infamies, and calumnies over 30 years, is that was simply one more invasion on the part of the United States, and we paid no particular attention. Castro explained, but a cable from the AP News Service on March 6, 1989, put him on his guard because the information coincided with rumors about the drug lord's claims, which friends brought him by various means from Colombia. These means were members of the guerrilla movement M19. The cable referred to 2 Cuban exiles in Miami, Ronaldo Ruiz and his 24-year-old son, Ruben, a pilot. Both had been arrested by the DEA and charged with drug trafficking. At their trial, they pled guilty to transporting more than a ton of cocaine to the United States by way of Cuba with the help of Cuban officials and officers. They testified they had many high-level contacts in Cuba, and they bragged of smoking tobacco from Castro's personal stash. The information noted the cable came from the Office of the Attorney General in Miami. Castro ordered the Minister of the Interior, General Abrantes, to investigate this matter. He had become aware that the United States Intelligence Service had, a good deal of information from as early as the mid-1987 about such operations, and that they knew the name of 2 of the Cuban military officers, one of whom was Tony de la Guardia. Washington kept this information secret as it prepared to spring on the world a spectacular coup. The plan was to kidnap General Abrantes and in the international waters and take him to a supposed meeting with the drug kingpin. It would become a combined operation by the CIA, the DEA, the Defense Information Agency, the Air Force, and the Navy, using combat aircraft, AWACS, destroyers, and submarines. The plan did not succeed, however, since the Cuban government revealed the scandal before the United States could act. Besides, a person of Abrantes' standing would not attend the meeting with drug traffickers. The reports in the Western media on the Ochoa case were biased against Cuba, with constant references to the Havana cartel, the Cuban connection, and Castrogate, placing Castro inside the international drug ring. One of the most devastating analyses of this scandal was written by Jean-Francis Vogel, the former Agence France Presse, correspondent in Cuba, in his book, The End of the Century in Havana, 1992. The United States Congress, the Departments of States and Justice, the Miami anti-Castroids, the dissident Huber Matos, and the deserter Rafael Del Pino, a former brigadier general, both living in exile in the United States, all accused the Cuban government, namely Raul Castro, of drug trafficking. They claimed that all the arrests of the military officers were purges to rid Castro of their rivals, especially Ochoa, asserting that they favored perestroika. The information was waged by the powerful United States media, the racist media frauds, and a score of anti-Castro broadcasters in Florida who also incited the Cuban people to rebel against the government. United States officials claimed that events in Cuba corroborated Washington's old accusations to the effect that high-ranking Cuban officials were involved in the drug trade. A cable from Spanish-language news agency EFE reported that the suspicions and reports made to Congress by high United States officials had been confirmed by two Cuban deserters. The cable was referring to Oscar Valdez, the brother of the former Minister of the Interior Ramiro Valdez, and Manuel Bayunza, a former Cuban intelligence agent. During the testimony before the Congress, they accused Raul Castro of having organized the drug traffic in Cuba and the Cuban embassy in Colombia of being a central connection for the drug lords between 1975 and 1980, when Fernando Rivera was ambassador. They also alleged that he had been the central connection for the drug lords. When members of Congress asked for proof from Fidel and Raul Castro's connection to the drug traffickers, they admitted that at the moment there is nothing specific, quote unquote. The Cuban government called this campaign an infamous downpour of accusations and calumnies, difficult to disprove since Cuba did not have the means to confront the powerful international communications network nexus controlled by the United States. Cuba expelled the Reuters correspondent, the 39-year-old Frenchman Gilles Tresques, for transmitting false information. He was taken from his home at dawn and put on a Cuban airline flight to Toronto. The 14 military officers were tried by a Revolutionary Armed Force Court of Honor made up of 44 divisions and brigadier generals and 2 rear admirals, and later by a 3-person military court. But the final word on their sentences came from the Council of the State, the highest governing body with 29 members and presided over by Castro. The trials were closed to the national and international press, international observers, several institutions had asked to attend, and the public. Only military officers and the relatives of the accused were allowed to attend. The trial, which the government called summary, took less than a month. Every night, a 2-hour edited videotape of the trial was aired on television. The government declared that the tape included the entire proceedings except matters of morality that could affect the innocent persons, or testimony that was too scandalous or might potentially damage Cuba's personal policies, Cuba's foreign policies, and which were not decisive factors for the verdicts that had to be passed. Ochoa, the brightest star in the Cuban military constellation, was the first to be questioned. He confessed his connection with the drug trade since the end of 1987. He declared, however, his intention, was not to traffic through Cuba, but to insert himself in the existing network between Colombia and Mexico, make big deals and get large quantities of money for a third party to invest in Cuban tourism and help Cuba. The drug traffic, he attested, was no more than an incidental consequence. He admitted to authorizing Martinez's trips to Colombia and knowing about the false Colombian passport. I permitted all of it, he confessed. Several officers testified against him regarding the contraband and the black market. Ochoa pleaded guilty to all charges. On the television screen, he looked profoundly troubled as he made a pathetic statement accepting the seriousness of his crime, his betrayal of the motherland, the revolution, and Fidel. He confessed to all the charges of which he stood accused and explicitly denied the statements made outside the country about political motives for the trial. It was to be expected that the enemy would try to exploit this. Nothing could be further than the truth than assigning political motives to my actions. He also denied that Fidel and Raul Castro were implicated in the drug trade, as was charged outside the country. He declared that he alone was responsible. I despise myself. A traitor pays for his treason with his life. If my sentence is that I will be shot, my last thought will be for Fidel and for our great revolution, which he gave to our people. The second to be tried was Colonel Tony de la Guardia, who admitted to having begun the drug trafficking operation in 1987 or the end of 1986. How many officers knew of this business, asked the prosecutor. Those who were arrested here, he replied. The prosecutor asked about meetings of Cubans with Colombians, Mexicans, and United States traffickers. He testified that Martinez had traveled to Colombia with a false passport, to which he answered yes. He explained that he did not know the 4 Colombian drug lords with whom Martinez met. The only Colombian I met was with Ramiro Lucio. This avowal caused a storm in Colombia in the M19 guerrilla movement. Lucio was their political spokesman, which was negotiating its return to civilian life with the Colombian government. The Colombian press headlined this information about Lucio to confirm the supposed connections between the guerrillas and the drug lords. United States Ambassador Louis Tams had already coined the term narco-guerrilla. Lucio claimed that the business with Cuba was legitimate trade, that the Ministry of Defense was informed of his relations with Cuba, and that Tony de la Guardia was the person in the Cuban Ministry of the Interior who had given permission. Lucio complained that he was one of the most investigated people in Colombia since his telephones had been tapped and his bank accounts watched for 10 years. I do not know what political intrigue is behind all this. It would be a dark desire to connect M19 with the dirty business of doing drug trafficking. De la Guardia accepted all the charges brought against him and admitted that he was the main person responsible, that none of his superiors knew about his drug activities. I am completely conscious of how great a mistake I have made, of the damage I have done to Fidel, to the revolution, to my comrades, my institution, my children. Irreparable damage, he said. The foreign press found his testimony vacillating and noted that he did not mention his immediate superior, to whom he had given part of the drug money, which cast some doubts on the Cuban leadership's knowledge of such activities. It seemed that he was trying to cover for someone, suggested one diplomat in Havana. The court of honor and the military court found the officers guilty of treason and ordered them stripped of rank and duties and dishonorably discharged from the army. Former General Ochoa, the former Colonel Tony de la Guardia, former Captain Martinez Valdez, and former Major Pedron Trujillo were sentenced to death by firing squad. The others, including the former captain in the Ministry of the Interior, Rosa Martin Abierna, were sentenced to 35, 25, and 10 years in prison, according to the seriousness of their crimes. Each member of the council state, presided over by Castro, corroborated the sentences in brief and emotion-laden statements. In the long speech delivered at the end of the council, Castro stated that the accused had compromised the prestige and security of the state and had dealt a blow to the principles, the dignity, and the honor of the Cuban Revolution. It was high treason, he noted, since they sold out the country, putting it at a serious risk, undermined the morale and prestige of the revolution, and weakened it in every way. He declared the punishment must be exemplary to the sentence, the most severe possible. Demands on Cuba asking clemency for those condemned to death and criticism of the trials and sentences came from the United States administration and Congress, other governments, Pope John Paul II, politicians, Latin American intellectuals and professionals, and human rights organizations. Some accused the Cuban government of having manipulated the trials. Others claimed that the defense worked not to disprove the charges, but to sink the accused even deeper. The defense was in fact poor and extremely limited. America's Watch stated the trials of the 4 who were sentenced to death were flagrant violations of the process and questioned how Minister of Defense Raul Castro, to whom the accused reported, could have served as witness. It demanded the political decision to commute these sentences. The American press, the racist American fraud press, the international news agency frauds, Miami and anti-Castroites, and, quote, dissidents in Cuba discounted the confessions and accused admitting their guilt. They claimed that Ochoa had been brought into court drugged. Ochoa called such accusations calumnies and shameless lies of imperialists. In spite of the international pressures, the 4 officers were shot at dawn on July 13th. The following day, in a sober note in Gramna, the government announced the executions. The allegations by the foreign press, human rights organizations and activists, anti-Castroites, deserters and dissidents about the manipulation of the trials and the political motives for eliminating Ochoa continued and were played up by the American racist Western media after the executions. Several dissidents and activists were arrested in Cuba and accused of spreading false information and denigrating the trials. Tony de la Guardia's wife told the foreign press that Castro betrayed them since he had told the revolution had to be saved. He led them to believe that they would not get the maximum sentence if they collaborated. Patricia de la Guardia made the same claim. made the same claim in a 20-page document dated in October 1991, which he managed to struggle out of prison, addressed to the Osmani Cienfuegos and Robert Robiana, members of the Cuban Communist Party Politburo. The partisan daily Le Monde published some fragments in 1992 in which Patricio claimed that his brother Tony had confessed to having carried out 4 drug trafficking operations and personally given $3 million to the Minister of the Interior, General Abrantes. He also noted that he was as sure as can be that Tony was authorized to carry out the clandestine operations for which he was shot. He added that the Cuban government was implicated in a multitude of illegal activities and named the prominent government figures who were involved in these matters. He did not mention Fidel or Raul Castro, but Le Monde noted that the text leaves no doubt about their role in this traffic, whose purpose was to obtain hard currency from the country. Delagardi mentioned psychological tortures to which he had been submitted and reported that the officer assigned to his defense did not even inquire about his military career and spoke with him for only 30 minutes before the trial. No member of the media mentioned that he had made exactly opposite statements during the trial. After this devastating scandal, Castro proposed to the United States that the two countries carry out joint operations against the drug traffic in the Caribbean. International news agencies reported that the State Department reacted coldly to this proposal, but the Representative Charles Rangel, the Democrat, who chaired the House Select Committee on Narcotics Abuse and Control, criticized Bush's negative reaction as ridiculous. He accused Bush of playing anti-communist politics and of putting the success of the war against drugs at risk. The former New York Times Latin American correspondent Tad Solst remarked that for reasons of national interest, Bush ought to have accepted Castro's offer instead of answering him with tired legalisms. In spite of the drug scandal, the tenacious campaign to discredit the revolution in Castro, and the vendetta on human rights theme, Cuba gained some victories in the international arena. In October 1989, 2 months after the executions, the World Health Organization presented Castro with the Help for the All Medal in recognition of Cuba's work in this field, both at home and abroad. And in spite of pressure from Washington, Cuba was elected a member of the United Nations Security Council 1990 to 1992 with the highest total vote ever recorded, 146 out of 156 possible votes. For 30 years, the United States had prevented this outcome. Cuba was also re-elected to the Food and Agriculture Organization Council and to the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva and re-elected in 1992. Time magazine published an opinion poll sponsored by the State Department in March 1990 that indicated that if elections were held in Cuba then, not only would the Communist Party win, but so would Castro. Castro also continued to receive emotional demonstration of support when he attended the ceremonies accompanying changes of government in Latin America. There were mini summits of presidents attended by the representative of the United States government. Again and again, national and foreign media headlines proclaimed, Fidel steals the show, Fidel is the star, Fidel against the center of attention. At the United Nations Conference of Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, 33 years after the triumph of the revolution, and attended by President Bush, Castro received a memorable standing ovation from the thousands of participants and demonstrations of admirations and affections by the Brazilian people. In 1994 in South Africa, when Nelson Mandela was sworn in, Castro was housed and praised by the people and the thousands invited to the ceremony. The press reported that members of the Clinton administration did not conceal their empathy with Castro, that some even greeted him warmly and had their pictures taken with him. The crisis of the embassies. In July 1990, Havana was caught in another serious diplomatic crisis when Cubans, men, women, and children pressed into the embassies of Czechoslovakia, where the communist regime had already fallen, Canada, and various European countries, including Spain. The Cuban government accused the United States of instigating the crisis. The fruit of Bush's feverish obsession with Cuba. The Cuban government held Jan DeMarc, the Jacques charge d'affaires responsible for the incidents, and proved that officials of the United States intersection and the West German the Western Embassy were participating in the actions. As on earlier occasions, Cuba announced that it would not negotiate with the people barricaded in the embassies and demanded that they leave the premises unconditionally. It promised not to exercise reprisals. A few days later, the people came out. The conflict with the Spanish embassy, however, was long and thorny, lasting 50 days and causing a serious confrontation between Madrid and Havana. There was a fiery exchange of insults between the Cuban authorities and the Spanish Chancellor Ferdinand Ordóñez. A raid of the Spanish diplomatic headquarters by Cuban forces that captured one asylum seeker. Protest by the Spanish government. Against this attack, the Cuban government apologized. The announcement by the Spanish Chancellor that the doors of the embassy would remain open to anyone who wanted to seek asylum, and the indefinite suspension of Spain's aid to Cuba, around 2.5 million a year. Castro responded angrily to these announcements. He declared that he renounced Spanish aid, which he once termed Pyrrhic, and laughed at the Chancellor's allegations, which he dismissed as the responses of an anguished colonial administrator, pointing to the Chancellor's scandalous lack of understanding of the matters of international law. He also accused him of wanting to cause a second Marielle. The infuriated Chancellor asked the European Economic Community to suspend aid to Cuba. On July 16, 1990, the 37th anniversary of the attack on the Moncada barracks, Castro dedicated a large part of his 3-hour speech to the current crisis, which he described as a true diplomatic war and a provocation planned by the United States, to which Spain and other European countries lent their support. He turned the tables on the Europeans, asking them to open an office in Havana for granting entry visas to their countries for Cubans who wanted to leave the island. Castro asked the United States to send ships if it wanted to take in the people who said they were persecuted in Cuba so that they could leave. He warned that he would not allow those who entered the embassies illegally to leave the country, nor would he accept the pressures from their governments to allow them to leave, since to do so would be acceptance of interference in Cuba's internal affairs. He saved another blow for Spain. He referred to the quintessential of Columbus's discovery of America pompous celebrations to which Spain was allocating millions of dollars as the commemoration of genocide and extermination of those indigenous to the new continent. As on previous occasions, the refugees voluntarily left the Spanish embassy and tensions lifted. Analysts said that Castro put Felipe Gonzalez's social government up against the wall by embarrassing Spain, whose ties to Cuba, its last colony in the hemisphere, had remained strong even under Franco's dictatorship, making it appear that Spain was collaborating in a conspiracy against Cuba planned by Washington. It was obvious that Castro's proposal, more like a challenge that the European countries open visa offices in Havana, fell on deaf ears. None was ready to open the doors to such legal immigration. They continued to give political asylum to anyone who made it into their countries, sometimes taking advantage of airlines bearing them to other destinations, turning a blind eye to the fact in most cases the Cubans themselves admitted that they had not been persecuted by the Cuban government. Changing times. On July 26, 1989, during that year's anniversary celebration of the attack on the Moncada barracks in Camagüey, Castro warned that Soviet aid might dwindle and that austerity and self-sufficiency were necessary. The people must make an effort to produce their own necessities. If the Soviet oil shipments diminished, he explained, or if they were to be canceled, Cuba will continue to be a socialist country, even if we have to return to the ox cart. And Cuba did. This was the year when the communist regimes of Eastern Europe began to fall. The Soviet economy was teetering, and Cuban trade with these markets, 85% of its total, 77% with the Soviet Union, was disappearing. As the Soviet economy was decentralized, many businesses stopped selling to Cuba. Others required cash payments. The clearing account with Moscow ended and the oil subsidy stopped. Another casualty for Cuba was the loss of revenues from the resale of excess Soviet oil to other countries, an important agreement between both countries, which represented somewhere between $200 million and $300 million a year. Cuba was left without oil capital or credit. Trade with the socialist world was reduced to a minimum. Comecon decided that Cuba was to pay cash for all transactions, and its foreign debt to the Soviet Union and European banks was enormous. Furthermore, Cuba was under brutal economic aggression from the United States. Many of the Cuban industry had been developed with Soviet bloc technology, and its economy was integrated with those of the Comecon countries. Cuba was a member to which it exported the tropical products they wanted. To supply these markets, Cuba developed the sugar and citrus industries at the expense of diversification, an error it later recognized. Trade with the socialist countries intended to lessen trade in the capitalist arena actually involved dependency, greater transportation costs, and inferior quality. But no other option was left by the United States blockade. Without markets and no longer receiving products of primary necessity that those markets exported, the raw materials necessary to its industries, and the oil the country needed, Cuba was more exposed than ever to the rigors of the blockade. In August 1990, a year and a half before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cuban government, period, in a time of peace, in preparation for what it called Option Zero, no oil. It imposed great restrictions on the consumption of petroleum fuels and electrical energy. It decreed daily rationing. The mechanization of Cuba, one of the successes of the revolution, made the lack of oil much more traumatic. This situation forced the country to scale back or suspend important development plans in order to take care of its priorities: food programs and the development of biotechnology. Cuba was one of the world leaders in the field, the pharmaceutical industry and tourism, important sources of foreign currency. Many businesses closed and industrial projects, including oil exploration, were suspended. Joint ventures with the Soviet Union were reduced. Among these, the construction of a nickel plant, thermal, electrical, and engineering projects, oil refiners, and the nuclear energy plant in Cienfuegos, all vital to Cuba. The closing of the businesses, cutbacks in the working hours, and layoffs of factories and workplaces resulted in high unemployment, leaving interrupted workers. Some were transferred to other businesses at their old wages, and Social Security covered the interruption. Those who did not accept transfers did not receive benefits. Students graduating from the university were encouraged to continue their studies or accept work in the fields. Agricultural micro brigades were established. Many basic necessities that had been freely available were now rationed at the same subsidized prices. Delays by the Soviet Union in sending cereals, flour, detergent, soap, rice, and other products meant that they had to be rationed. Because of the scarcity of paper pulp, all publications were downsized, others disappeared. The scarcity of products came to be known as destabilizamento, deprovisioning. The government increased its agricultural plan, and those for the raising of domestic annuals launched a victory campaign of home vegetable gardens for which it distributed seeds and tools. At the end of 1991, the CDRs announced that there were already 796,000 gardens throughout the country. To stimulate the production, the government created the Unidades Básicas de Producción Cooperativa, basic units of the cooperative production. In the agricultural sector, tractors were replaced by oxen. By October 1991, 200,000 animals were already trained and in service. It was harder to replace machines with manual labor in the sugar industry. Given the country's circumstances, Castro noted, it was more difficult to house, feed, and equip thousands of workers than to use oil. The merchant and fishing fleets were nearly paralyzed, and freight and public transport systems had to be reduced drastically. The government moved to close this gap by importing massive numbers of Chinese bicycles and adapting 6 factories to bicycle production. By the end of 1991, it distributed more than 1 million bicycles. Horse-drawn carriages and carts roamed cities and countryside to help out with transport. Such efforts helped, but they did not pull Cuba out of its economic doldrums. The people suffered because of lack of basic necessities. The daily power blackouts, the transportation difficulties, getting to work on time was much harder, and the poor communication system, since the telephone often did not work. Cuba running on empty, a Colombian paper headline, The Prophets of Doom in the Hemisphere Predicted Violent Outcomes. One of the government's highest priorities was the stimulation of foreign investment. It created joint ventures in the tourist sector and in the citrus and cement industries and signed high-risk agreements for cooperation in oil exploration and extraction. Was Cuba becoming capitalist? Castro insisted that this was not the case. Foreign investment does not contradict any principle of socialism or Marxism-Leninism of the revolution. Cuba increased its search for new markets in Europe, Latin America, and Canada, difficult and competitive markets in hard currency and at bargain basement prices, or so Castro described the unequal exchange, since the price of sugar, Cuba's main export, in these markets was lower than its production costs. Everywhere Cuba came up against the barriers of the United States blockade, they were not always surmountable, and businesses and investors canceled their agreements with Cuba because of Washington's pressures, threats, and blackmail. This brutal blockade imposed by huge hardships on the people. Castro warned that they had not yet seen the worst. Greater difficulties were still to come, but that to resist is to win. In October 1991, the Fourth Congress of the Cuban Communist Party opened with the slogan, "Save the country, the revolution, and socialism." Cuba was in the midst of its most serious and dangerous crisis, barraged by a radio war from Florida urging the Cuban people to rebel and organize protests, and by the United States military maneuvers at Guantanamo, which stimulated evacuations. The government foresaw the danger of an invasion. The crucial meeting, which had been postponed several times by the increasing deterioration of the socialist world, aroused great expectations with the country and abroad, although Castro warned that there would be no spectacular changes or multi-part market or free market system. Outside the island, many believed that this Congress offered the last chance for the Cuban regime to transform the country and avoid a violent outcome. In the situation of external threat, internal anxieties, and uncertainty, the Fourth Congress began. Without invited observers, national or foreign press, the 1,800 delegates from all over the country met for 4 days. In this 5-hour opening speech, Castro gave a detailed exposition of Cuba's dramatic situation, the devastating effects of the disappearances of the socialist regime, and the decline of the Soviet Union and Cuba's economy. He described the Soviet regime situation as a disgrace. The CPSU had been dissolved by decree. The country was incredibly weakened and was faced with a serious threat of disintegration. He noted that perestroika awakened sympathies among the Cuban people, since the first reports were interesting and pleasing about the improvements of socialism, but that its results were disastrous. The resolutions approved by the party Congress hinged on economic and social development plans, restructuring of the party to democratize it and to trim it of its bureaucracy, a new electoral system, the direct, secret, and non-binding voting, and an easing of restrictions concerning religious beliefs. The final measure was one that had the greatest impact on public opinion within the country and abroad. The Cuban Communist Party receives God was the heading from the Colombian paper. The Cuban bishops hailed this opening in a pastoral letter, but noted that truly democratic changes were necessary. Evangelicals and Protestants applauded the change. Cuba was forced to adapt to the new international conditions and to refine its government without capitulating to capitalism. Castro pointed to the socialist regimes of Eastern Europe and the consequences of yielding to capitalist pressure. They gave a finger, later an arm, and finally had their heads ripped off. In December 1991, the National Assembly of Popular Power took up approval of the reform of the 1976 Constitution in the spirit of the socialist system and based on what the Fourth Congress of the CCP had approved. The reform was adopted by unanimous voice vote. The text eliminated reference to the Soviet Union and the socialist world from the preamble and introduced the ideology of José Martí, the apostle of the struggle for Cuban independence, alongside the doctrines of Marx and Lenin, or of the Communist Party as the sole party, the vanguard and main forces directing society and the state. It also improved the new electoral law, allowing for direct and secret voting. The minimum age to vote or be elected to provincial and municipal assemblies was 16, and 18, the age majority in Cuba for the National Assembly. Elections were won with 50% of the vote. Proportional representation of the National Assembly was maintained as one deputy for every 20,000 people, or any fraction over 10,000. In 1991, the number of members grew from 510 to 589. The election of the chief of state and the council of state continued to be a function of the assembly to avoid politicking and a war among the candidates, noted Castro. The new constitution established greater guarantees for foreign investment, broadened religious freedoms. The CCP approved the admission of believers to the party and opened the economic system based on the concept of socialist property to the possibility of transferring state property to private persons or legal entities for economic ends in exceptional cases. In its final declaration, the Assembly condemned the United States' aggression against the country and called on the Cuban people to fight counter-revolutionary crime and delinquency. It also rejected, quote, value judgments on Cuba by foreign governments and parliaments, calling them unproductive monologues, quote unquote, since they were made at Western meetings where Cuba had been neither present nor invited. This was the criticism of the Rio Group, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela for having questioned a recent meeting in Cartagena, Colombia, and the Cuban political system and measures taken by the Cuban government that, in its judgment, constituted an obstacle to the real continental existence. The Rio Group was referring to the detention of 12 activists and dissidents in Cuba and to Castro's announcement that there would be no opening for counter-revolution. The declaration concluded that it was not markets that were on the line, but survival and independence of Cuba, and it called 1992 the year of trial by fire for the revolution. In a closing speech, Castro promised that Cuba would demonstrate to make a revolution with the democratic principles and the democracy with one party, though it be under the most difficult conditions, and claimed that Cuba was the most democratic country in the world. He concluded that the slogan, socialism or death, to applause and shouts of support for the revolution and Fidel. Cuba put a new electoral law to the test in the midst of hostile and frenetic radio war from Florida, exhorting the people to stay away from the polls, invalidate their vote, or leave the ballots blank. The elections for municipal and provincial assemblies were held in December 1992, and those for the National Assembly took place in February 1993. For the first time, the people elected their representatives directly based on participation, 97% and 99.6% respectively. And the results, the government called the vote a massive referendum, the support for the government and the revolution. Most of the votes were for candidates from the states offered by the mass organizations as the government recommended. Invalidated votes were 7% and 10%, and the blank ballots were 3% and 4% of the total, respectively. No opposition representative ran for office in the wide-ranging discussions in the 24,215 local assemblies. No proposals of counter-revolutionary nature were presented. So we're going to make some comments. So we started with, basically the first part of it was the regime for the Soviet Union. We discussed Gorbachev. Gorbachev was basically, ousted from the Communist Party. He was arrested by Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin basically brought down the Communist Party. We understood that, after the arrest, imperialism was what Castro felt. The reason for the destruction of the Communist Party was imperialism. That the United States racist, murderous, butchers, the rapists of George Bush and, murderous butcher George Bush, helped to bring down the Soviet Union through their, vicious campaign of economic warfare against the Soviet Union. That's what Castro said. And it would not have been able to destroy them if the Soviets have not helped destroy it first. He felt that, the presence of, all of these issues in the Soviet Union kind of destroyed its own, own process. So, then there were blows from the empire we discussed. George Bush, began the Castro thought that George Bush was going to be a relief for Cuba. He ended up being a more, dangerous, racist, murderous butcher. He is a rapist. George Bush is a rapist and a murderer. That's what we found from his vicious campaigns across both Iraq and in, Latin America. His, vicious campaign against Panama, explains why he is a rapist, a mass murderer, and a torturer of the U.S. government, a racist butcher of the American government. So basically, Bush was, the annual speech, he said that Castro said that never has the United States government, not even Ronald Reagan, exhibited so triumphalist an attitude as Bush, as he is threatening to us now. Christ turns his back. We talked, a few days later about, some, arrests that were made, the drug arrests by the Cuban government. Castro had arrested General Ochoa, Patricia de la Guardia, Antonia de la Guardia, and Captain Martinez Valdez. Basically, these people were arrested by the Communist Party for being involved in a drug smuggling ring. A pretty open trial, a pretty open, fair trial by Castro. He, let them speak. They were pretty straightforward. They admitted their guilt. They didn't, discuss or hide their guilt. They were not like the racist, murderous, butcher, deceitful liar, frauds of the U.S. government and their vicious public, their racist public who hide their, criminal actions and then, make other people suffer for their criminality. That's ultimately the United States, modus operandi is racist, murderous butchery and, criminal cover-ups of murder, racist theft. That is the U.S. government. So basically, Castro open trial. Castro ordered, basically they were, smuggling $3.4 million of, cocaine from Colombia back to the Florida Keys. They went through Cuba. They went from Colombia back to Varadero, an airfield, a military base, because General was a military man. Ochoa was a military general. So, he was able to, bring the money through, through the Cuban division general. He was able to bring the money through Cuba back to the Florida and make money for the Communist Party is what he said. But he didn't, there was no real description of it. But for the most part, it seemed he was an honest man. He just said that, I don't know what happened. I don't know why this happened or what ended up happening. So Castro, basically the U.S. government, jumped on the propaganda bandwagon, the U.S. accusations that the Cuban government officials were involved in drug trafficking. Castro described America as a nation of decadence, incapable of overcoming the internal consumption and stupefaction. It means that they are a nation of, prostitutes, whores, racist thieves, pimps, and murderous butchers. That is what the subtle points are in that statement. Decadence means, open theft, open, priority for myself. I'm the only one involved. The racist, self-serving, murderous white Roman Catholic butchers of the U.S. government, the racist butchers of the murderous American regime, the racist regime, the Ku Klux Klan butchers of the U.S. government, the racist Ku Klux Klan butchers. So continuing on, we continued. So we said Washington. So we described, the whole issue. The whole issue was the warfare. There was an information war. So we see the Western propaganda in this trial against these four generals. The Western propaganda, it was basically the information, there was a Western media propaganda. The Western media on the Ochoa case was biased against Cuba with constant references to the Havana cartel, the Cuban connection, Castrogate, placing Castro inside the international drug ring. One of the most devastating analysis of this scandal was written by a racist French colonialist, Jean-Francois Fogel, the former Agence France press correspondent in Cuba. And he wrote a book, The End of the Century of Havana. This is how all the information of Western propagandists, the lies and deceitful media of the West, the European racist media of Britain and France spread throughout the world. They, bring this disinformation, this misinformation, and, characterize basically the antro-Castroites, the United States Congress, the Department of States and Justice, Miami anti-Castroites, and dissident Herbert Mastos, both living in exile, all accused the Cuban government of drug trafficking. He wrote a book basically saying that Castro was behind the scandal. Castro was within an international drug ring. There's no evidence in these accusations. These are all fraud accusations by the Western liars. They're Western deceitful con artists. That is what this Western media propaganda is. It is a group of con artists. It is a nexus of cartels of con artists, of journalism. It's mafia journalism for colonialism, for the sake of colonialism, a mafia group of, vicious thugs. So the information war, we described, the information war was waged by the powerful United States media and a score of anti-Castro broadcasters in Florida who also incited the Cuban people to rebel against the government. United States officials claim that the events in Cuba corroborated Washington's old accusations of the effect that its high-ranking Cuban officials were involved in the drug trade. A cable from the Spanish-language news agency reported that the suspicions and reports made by Congress by high United States officials had been confirmed by two Cuban deserters. The cable was referring to Oscar Valdez, the brother of the former Minister of the Interior Ramiro Valdez, and Manuel Biunza, a former Cuban intelligence agent. During the testimony before the U.S. Congress, they accused Raul Castro of having organized the drug trafficking in Cuba and the Cuban embassy in Colombia being a central connection for the drug lords' raids between 1975 and 1980. They also alleged that he had been the central connection for the drug lords. When members of Congress asked for proof of Fidel and Raul Castro's connection, they admitted there was nothing specific. So basically, the Congress, the U.S. Congress, the racist liars, all of this information war waged by the U.S. media, it all comes from the racist frauds of the Congress. They pretend that they are, above objectivity. They are like objective gods. They are objective cheats. They are objective frauds of the racist white Congress. And it's, basically just a campaign of misinformation, lies, just peddle the lies, falsify, fabricate, omit, whatever you have to do just so that you get the job done and you say that Castro is the criminal. Who is the criminal? The U.S. racist, murderous butchers, the colonial imperialist, anti-third world, racist, anti-Hispanic butchers of the U.S. government. They are anti-Hispanic butchers, whites of America. So continuing on, so Cuba basically expelled the United States Reuters correspondent, the 39-year-old Frenchman Gilles Tresca, for transmitting false information, which was a good thing. Reuters correspondent was expelled from Cuba. Cuba did not have a means to confront the International Communications Network. The problem is the International Communications Network is such a nexus of powerful corporate frauds. They have money beyond imagine. And for, someone like Castro, a small, poor country that is, trying to keep their sovereignty, they have to just get them out. Get out Yankee, get out Westerners, get out European frauds, get out Frenchmen and British. That is what they have to say. That is ultimately the thing that has to be done. Otherwise, they subjected themselves to unnecessary scrutiny, unnecessary, double checking by racist frauds that are seeking only to enslave the Hispanic people and steal the Hispanic money. That is ultimately what it is. And so we went through this, basically the, false information. Reuters correspondents were expelled, powerful international communications network that's controlled by the United States, the European nexus of, the U.S. media. It's all controlled and it is all a, problematic situation, but that's a story for additional reading and additional books, which, at some point we will get to. We also were talking about, the plan of the CIA to DAA and Defense Information Agency, the Air Force, the Navy, the combat aircraft, AWACS, destroyers, and submarines of the racist United States murderous butchers to kidnap General Abrantes, one of the people that, were involved in the drug trade, and to wage a coup against Castro. The plan didn't succeed, of course, since the Cuban government revealed the scandal before the United States could act. So that was, an important fact. So the U.S., again, an attempt at subversion against the Cuban government, a democratically elected government for which the totalitarian, racist, fascist colonial butchers of the U.S. government try to, wage a vicious campaign of, overthrow against the Cuban people. Then we talked about, basically, so the drug addicts, the drug traffickers, the ones who made money, were convicted of crime and, called death by a firing squad. General Ochoa, former General Ochoa, De La Guardia, Martinez Valdez, and Trujillo were sentenced to death by firing squad. And then they have prison sentences for the other members. Basically at the end of it, despite international pressures, they were shot despite international pressures. So the international press, basically, said that, this was a, fraudulent trial, again, peddle the lies, no evidence, no basis, just because you're white frauds, you're corporate fraud liars with a lot of money. You just peddle the nonsense and garbage, rely on your prestige of whiteness to, peddle the bullshit, to the public. And then everyone, believes that Cuba, did an unfair trial. Talk about trials, talk about the pot calling the kettle black. The U.S. government, Justice Department is a group of white frauds. They are pro-white, pro-murderous, anti-third world frauds. That is ultimately what it is. And then so finally, Le Monde, basically, we talked a lot about the Cuban government. Le Monde, we had this discussion of Le Monde. Granmo, the allegations by the foreign press, human rights organizations, and activists, anti-Castroites. That's someone to include in the the allegations. Deserters and dissidents. What is this? Like, you're bringing anti-Castroites and dissidents of Cuba into an allegations against Cuba? What a racist group of Western frauds. This is the kind of nonsense that the Western propagandist liars push forward. They are vicious thugs. They're not journalists. It's a mafia group. So they the anti-Castroites, deserters, and dissidents talked about manipulation of the trials and the political motives for eliminating Ochoa, and continued and were played up by the media after the execution. Several dissidents and activists were arrested in Cuba and spread false information about the denigrated the trials. So that's a good point to be aware of. In spite of the drug scandal, Time magazine published an opinion poll sponsored by the State Department in March 1990 that indicated the elections were held in Cuba then. Not only would the Communist Party win, but what would also Cuba. So basically, he attended there were many summits of presidents attended by the representatives of the United States government. Again and again, the national media headlines proclaimed Fidel steals the show, Fidel the star, Fidel, again, the center of attention. The UN Conference of Development we discussed. The Brazilian people. Oh, okay. So the Castro got a standing ovation from the Brazilian people. Remember, the Brazilian people were subjected to a military fascist colonial regime of white thugs by the racist, murderous butchers of the U.S. government, the racist Ku Klux Klan butchers, the mafia government of the United States, what we call a government, which is just a loosely formed group of white mafia, murderers, mafia gangsters. That's ultimately what they end up being. So basically, he was praised by South Africa. Nelson Mandela was sworn in, and Castro was housed and praised by the people of South Africa and invited to the ceremony that took place in Rio de Janeiro. Many of the many even American presidents were sympathetic with Castro, but at that time they were previously discussed. Basically, so there was a little bit, a rift between the Spanish embassy, the Spanish government, which at that time was fascist or close to it, and it was very good friends with the United States and Washington. So you have to know the rightist racists and how the colonialists, when they set up their racist fascists in the Europe, they plant the people. The U.S. government and the European thugs of Britain and France will plant the politicians in Spain, and then you'll have a right-wing dictator who will become inimical to Latin American problems. He will become anti-Latin American, anti-indigenous, and he will be for Washington's agenda of imperialism of Latin American land. Something important to note. So the Spanish Chancellor, Francisco Ordóñez, basically condemned a raid of the Spanish headquarters by the Cuban forces and attacked the Cuban government, because there were hundreds of people trying to get asylum. They were trying to leave. Basically, Castro degraded these announcements and said that these are, ridiculous statements. Basically, there was basically a war of words between Spain as well as other Europeans. There was a true diplomatic war and provocation planned by the United States, to which Spain and other European countries left themselves, as Castro dedicated a large part of this 3-hour speech. So remember, the Spanish, situation is because the United States racist, murderous butchers, the racist, murderous butchers of the U.S. government, caused that campaign. So that was that. And then, basically he talked about Columbus's discovery. Remember the Columbus discovery of America, which a pompous celebration, which Spain was allocating millions of dollars as the commemoration of the genocide and extermination of the indigenous people, the Indians of the new continent. And I agree with that statement that, Columbus was a crazy genocidal maniac. He was a genocidal racist and a European white supremacist that, had major flaws in his theories, just like the racist butchers of England, France, and the United States. They all fit the same white supremacist garbage that, they push out. They peddle garbage and colonial butchery of third world nations based on their vicious lies and propaganda. So that was that, and then we can, finish up. So then, everyone, knew that the Spain was collaborating with the United States in all of these things. It was all a collaboration. The Europeans were collaborating with the United States, and then we finally, went through. The next party was the changing times. There was some, trouble. The Soviet Union, all of the discussions of the Soviet Union crumbling. The Soviet Union crumbling. Victory Gardens campaign. The different things of the Soviet Union, had major effects on Cuba. And then finally, in the final declaration, which was this Cuban Communist Party, the new constitution, in the final declaration, the assembly condemned the United States' aggression against the country and called on the Cuban people to fight counter-revolution crime and delinquency. It also rejected quote-unquote value judgments on Cuba by foreign governments and parliaments, as well as their press, calling them unproductive monologues, since they were made at meetings where Cuba had been neither present nor invited. There were criticisms of the Rio Group, which was, formed by Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela, for having questioned the Cuban political system and measures taken by the Cuban government. The Rio Group discussed the real continental coexistence. At that time, again, the Rio Group was a group of dictatorships run by the U.S. government. It was a group of right-wing dictatorships run by Washington, the racist butchers of the U.S. government. And then finally, all these organizations, put their statements out. So let's continue the home stretch. Day by day, Cuba's relations with the Soviet Union deteriorated in every way. The communist power could no longer comply with its export agreements, and Cuba lacked oil. Commercial exchange, now in cash, marked the end of the favorable conditions Cuba had enjoyed for more than 30 years. However, military aid continued. In January 1991, Moscow, disregarding Washington's protest, announced that it was sending MiG-29 fighter planes to Cuba. And in June, Soviet Chief of Staff General Mikhail Moisev and Rear Admiral Alexander Burganov arrived in Havana as the head of the naval detachment. They had come to deal with matters pertaining to the two countries' military cooperation. The Soviet ambassador assured Havana that shipments of arms to Cuba would not be reduced, and that such support would cease only when Cuba's relations with the violent United States improved. Nevertheless, Cuba began to receive worrisome and contradictory messages from Moscow. High Soviet leaders remarked on the need to establish a new type of relations, and there were many items in the Soviet media about the growing opposition in sectors of the parliament to those favorable relations with Cuba at a moment when the Soviet Union was experiencing grave economic difficulties. In June 1991, the Soviet chancellor arrived in Havana to discuss a new 5-year economic cooperation agreement. The Soviet Union reduced its exports to Cuba by a third and was importing only a quarter of the Cuban products it once did. The Soviet Union was weakening internally and throughout the international arena, and Gorbachev also weakened and depending on United States assistance that did not come. fell into the vortex of Washington's influence. There was a coming and going of officials at the highest levels between Washington and Moscow. Some of the Soviets passed through Havana as they returned from Washington to rectify their agreements. Relations between Washington and Moscow were going so well that Aeroflot, the Soviet airlines, obtained permission to establish a route from Moscow to Miami and on to another country. Aeroflot dropped its Havana route. In September 1991, a month after the coup against Gorbachev, Secretary of State James Baker went to Moscow for consultations. The main topic was Cuba. He and Gorbachev talked for more than 3 hours and at a press conference, and later announced the modification and modernization of relations with Cuba and his decision to withdraw from the island the Soviet military brigade, which had been there since the missile crisis in 1962. A smiling Baker remarked that this gesture was very significant and favorable for the relations between those two countries. As Castro learned of the announcement that the brigade would be withdrawn from international news wires, and he reacted angrily, declaring that this was an unprecedented attitude. A long editorial in Granma indicated that this unilateral Soviet decision was tantamount to giving the green light to the United States to attack Cuba. Granma noted that though this brigade, 11,000 soldiers, were unimportant for the defense of Cuba, it held profound significance as an expression of the friendship and solidarity of the Soviet Union. The article also stated that the proposals by Foreign Minister Boris Pankin, Shevardnadze had resigned for the eventual steps the United States might take in exchange for the withdrawal of the brigade. He suggested reducing the number of military personnel at Guantanamo were extremely modest and unimportant. It was evident Granma declared that the Soviet Union had negotiated with made concessions to the United States with regard to Cuba without having actually spoken with Cuba. The eternal friendship between Cuba and the Soviet Union evaporated. November 7th was the date on which the Soviet Union commemorated the October Revolution, and the day when its embassy in Havana held grand receptions attended by Fidel and Raul Castro and high-ranking functionaries and generals who were seldom seen at diplomatic functions. But on that date in 1991, the embassy remained closed. The Cuban government, on the other hand, recalled this memorable event with significant ceremonies in Havana and other cities. The glee of the anti-Castroites. Bush received the news of Soviet brigade's withdrawal with particular enthusiasm and predicted Castro's falls. It will be sooner than he imagines, he declared. Such declarations coincided with the Soviet chancellor's arrival in Havana to negotiate with the Cuban authorities about the withdrawal. In Miami, the anti-Castroites hailed it as a powerful psychological blow and the beginning of the end of the Castro regime. So great was the enthusiasm of Maz Canosa, the leader of the United States anti-Castroites and president of CANF, that he left for Moscow within the week. Now he was discovering affinities for the Kremlin leaders. I feel an emotion I have not been able to transcend, he told a Spanish journalist who called him from Miami. I, who have fought all my life against the values this country represents, have found here a friendly hand. I have received assurances that the subsidies for Cuba will stop and that the Soviet troops will return to their country and the military aid will be eliminated. Mr. Canosa aspired to replace Castro. His followers addressed him respectfully as Mr. President, wrote the New York Times in an article about him, for which he refused to be interviewed. CANF had prepared a new constitution for Cuba, and Maz Canosa had a social, political, and economic program for the reconstruction of Cuba along capitalist lines. He died in 1997 of a serious illness which had been kept secret until the last moment. More than 100,000 people from the Cuban community accompanied his cortege to the cemetery in Miami. Maz Canosa had been the symbol of the United States Cuban exiles' resistance to Fidel Castro. The anti-Castro media in Florida, exhorted the Cuban people to rebel. The terrorist group Alpha 66, based in Miami, sped up the training of its forces to launch the liberation of Cuba, quote unquote, and members of the Cuban American community, more than 600,000 lived in Florida, put their houses on the market before the expected fall of the government. For when it did fall, there would be an exodus of the island and prices would drop through the floor. Florida Governor Bob Martinez, a Cuban American, named a commission to deal with the disturbances that would follow the fall of the Cuban regime. Castro noted sarcastically, Over there, the Miami people are packing their bags. The vendetta continues, quote unquote. Bush continued the vendetta against Cuba in the Human Rights Commission in Geneva, and the CIA kept up its support of activist human rights groups and Cuban dissidents to encourage international dissatisfactions. When the Eastern European socialist regimes fell, Bush stepped up the aggression, now under the banner of democratization. He demanded free elections, a term that implied a multi-party system and a market economy. Meanwhile, the activities of these small human rights groups were an irritating problem for the Cuban government, not because they were an integral threat, but because of the campaigns against Cuba organized by Washington and the Miami anti-Castroites and the tensions they created with other governments. In August 1989, the authorities arrested Elizardo Sanchez, the leader of the commission, and the Commission de Derechos Humanos y Reconciliación Nacional, Human Rights and National Reconciliation Commission, and leaders of other human rights groups. Granma accused them of spreading calumnies in their declarations of foreign television networks and anti-Cuban broadcasters sponsored by the United States. The purpose of discrediting the Cuban courts, they condemned the execution of Ochoa and other officers, calling them assassinations, and claimed that the Cuban authorities had drugged Ochoa before bringing him to the courtroom, and that all the defendants were victims of mistreatments and psychological torture. Washington condemned the arrest as a flagrant violation of human rights in the renewed actions of the Cuban government, and against activists, against the human rights perspective of the racist, murderous, anti-Hispanic butchers of the U.S. government. Amnesty International and America's Watch, in a separate report, expressed their concerns at the significant worsening of the situation in Cuba compared with the previous year. The criminalization of such groups, the arrest of their members, Castro's declarations that he would not allow counter-revolutionary activities, and their occasionally violent harassment of the people invited strong protests from foreign governments and celebrities. They accused Cuba of repression, violating human rights, and failing to honor the civil liberties of freedom of speech and association. The activists claimed that their attackers were transported in government's buses and that members of the state security forces dressed in civilian clothes had participated. They also alleged that the Rapid Action Brigades had taken part in the attacks. The October 1991 arrests of Maria Elena Cruz Varela and 3 members of her movements accused of defaming the state institutions, printing publications, and having secret meetings brought severe criticism. The Rio Group, meeting in Cartagena, Colombia, indicated that these arrests and Castro's declaration were an obstacle to Cuba's reintegration into the inter-American system. In a joint statement with 4 other former Costa Rican presidents, Nobel Peace Laureate Oscar Arias asked the Cuban government to free the prisoners, and in Havana, embassies of the European Economic Community countries made clear to the government concern about the increase in repression in Cuba. The Cuban government accused Washington of stimulating internal and public opposition, and published and circulated among the HRC in Geneva a copy of the communications from the CIA office in Madrid, dated July 1991, urging these groups to become opposition parties. The Cuban government noted that its denunciation was met with silence from the international Western media. In 1994, it published a top-secret document from the United States Interest Section in Havana to the Secretary of State, the CIA, and the INS, which showed the nature of these groups, their activities, and accusations of repression, of which they said they were victims. The document stated that in the application for visas to leave Cuba, most did not show a real fear of persecution, but rather a discomfort because of the deterioration in the economic situation. The document reported that in spite of doing everything possible to work with the human rights organization to identify the activists who were being persecuted by the government, the human rights cases represented the weakest part of the refugee program. Rarely did they present reliable evidence of repression, persecution, searches of their home, interrogations, detentions, or arrests or harassment by state security. In addition, it declared that some were fraudulent, since there was the sale of testimonial guarantees. Immigration officials regarded human rights cases as those most susceptible to fraud, it added. The United States was beaten 3 years running in the HRC. It could not win a condemnation of Cuba, Latin America, the socialist countries, and the Third World supported the island nation. In 1990, the United States finally succeeded with the addition of yes votes from Hungary and Bulgaria, whose communist regimes had already been toppled, and from Panama. The rest of Latin America abstained. Only Mexico voted with Cuba. The Cuban ambassador, Raul Roa, noted that the nay votes and the abstentions, all from third world countries, showed that the majority had not bowed to imperialism. And Castro, furious, accused his former allies of betrayal for having voted in favor of this scurrilous and cynical anti-Cuban motion, since their votes and that of the United States military occupation government, he meant Panama, encouraged imperialist aggression. He declared that if Cuba was attacked by military means, those governments that have been capable of writing such an infamous page of history will be responsible for the blood of Hispanics that are spilled here. Rivers of blood will flow. We have the weapons, and our army is composed of all our people. In 1991, the United States once again managed to get Cuba condemned with the help of formerly socialist countries, Argentina and Panama. The resolution asked the HRC to name a special representative for Cuba. The 126-page report on human rights in Cuba, presented by Rafael Rivas Posada, the special representative of the United Nations Secretary General, accused Cuba of a variety of violations and singled out the alarming increase in political cases of persecution of activists and dissidents. It mentioned abusive, quote-unquote, psychiatric treatment trials without the requisite guarantees and limitations of the right of free expression and association, and expressed concern at the creation of rapid response brigades, civilian groups created by the government to deal with public protests. Rivas Posada's mission was to observe this situation in situ, because the Cuban government denied him entry, He based his report on the declarations by exiled Cubans, human rights groups outside Cuba, and such organizations of Amnesty International and America's Watch. These actions are more indicative of the racist, murderous, anti-Hispanic American butchers. This psychiatric treatment, abusive psychiatric treatment, increased political persecution of activists and dissidents, all traits of the U.S. fascist, colonial, racist, anti-Hispanic butchers. Rivas' report was met with severe criticism from some of the delegates. Rower rejected it as unilateral for making value judgments and accepting at face value the claims of known enemies of the Cuban Revolution. And he questioned the validity of information given by the 21 Cuban human rights groups, since 5 of these consisted of one and the same individual. In 1992, Cuba was again condemned. This time, the United States had the support of Russia, Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, and Uruguay. The rest of Latin America abstained. The resolutions added that Rivas be named special reporter on Cuba, a particularly serious sanction. Rivas declined the nomination for personal reasons. Granma noted that Washington would have a hard time finding someone of Rivas Posada's prestige to fill the post. Roa rejected the nomination of special reporter to his country, since such a statement was discriminatory and applied only to those countries that persistently and massively violated human rights. He pointed out the report of the HRC Commission that had gone to Cuba. Rivas Posada was a member, contradicted Washington's accusations against his country. He warned that his government would not allow the reporter to enter, nor would it cooperate with him. The Cuban government accused Russia of knuckling under to United States pressures to attack Cuba, and Granma called a reception offered by the Russian delegation in the old Soviet embassy in Geneva a stateless binge, and commented that the place had been turned into a Russian dive. The Cuban dissidents Carlos Franchi, David Moya, and Ricardo Bofill were guests at this reception and appeared in a New York Times photograph, drinks in hand, standing next to the Russians celebrating the victory. The foreign press played up Russia's abandonment of its old ally. The United States continued to win condemnation of Cuba with the support of the formerly socialist countries and the abstentions of Latin America. The Clinton administration continued this vendetta, quote unquote. But at the HRC meeting in Geneva in the spring of 1998, the United States suffered its first defeat in 7 years. The resolution against Cuba presented along with 21 other countries did not pass. 19 voted against it, and most of Latin America abstained. The 27-vote majority from the 53 members could not be won. The Cuban delegates celebrated the victory. Today, justice has been done, and a blow has been struck against United States policies against his country, he remarked, and turned the accusation against the United States because of its traditional support for military, racist, anti-Hispanic dictatorships, its economic warfare against his country, and violating human rights with its embargo. Fidel's Contras, quote unquote. I'm going to just take a short break. I'll be back in 30 seconds. Glad you could join us today. We'll be done in about, probably, 1 hour and 10 minutes or so. Okay, we're continuing with Fidel's Contras. Within a span of 10 days, 2 serious incidents occurred in Cuba, both ended by firing squad. On December 28, 1991, a commando composed of 3 anti-Castroites led by Eduardo Diaz Betancourt entered the island. The others were Daniel Santovenia Fernandez and Pedro Pedroza. They were captured as they arrived, and their weapons, munitions, explosives, and anti-Castro propaganda were seized. Some people in Miami believe that Diaz Betancourt, who had left Cuba illegally the year before, was a Cuban government infiltrator. During long interrogations, the captives described how the commando was supposed to be made up of 22 combatants, but that because of internal conflicts, it was reduced to 3. They claimed that their relatives knew nothing about the plan, and that the brains behind it, considered heroic by some in Miami and stupid by others, was Tony Suesta, a former Cuban prisoner and founder of the terrorist organization Alpha 66 and chief of the Commando L, another terrorist group of anti-Castroite paramilitaries. The objective was to carry out sabotage in movie theaters, dance halls, and recreation areas to create panic among the people, and later to dynamite important economic installations. They reported they had been assured in Miami that Cuba was on the verge of insurrection. I now realize, said Santovenia, that the United States government has used me. The Cuban government announced that it would impose death sentences, the punishment for terrorist acts against the security of the state. This announcement was met with expressions of rejections and petitions from clemency from Latin American governments and celebrities, anxiety among the relatives, and indignation from the anti-Castroites. In Miami, there were public protests, small in numbers, but widely reported by the Florida media, reported the Associated Press. Diaz Betancourt was the only one sentenced to death. The other 2 were given 30 years of prison. The other incident came on January 9, 1992 in Tarara, 10 miles from Havana. 3 soldiers were killed and 1 seriously wounded when 7 people, including 2 women, were trying to steal a boat to leave the country, disarmed the soldiers, tied them up, and shot them. The crime, very rare in Cuba, invited profound indignation throughout the nation. Radio stations in Granma overwhelmed by petitions and the perpetrators to be given the death penalty. Luis Miguel Almeida Perez, Rene Salman Perez, the leaders were sentenced to to death by firing squad for piracy and murder. For two members of the group, the sentence was commuted because one was mentally retarded and the other was a minor. They were sentenced to 25 and 30 years in prison, respectively, and the two women were given 10 years. Little is known as what happened to the seventh. The execution of Diaz Betancourt on January 20 unleashed a persistent campaign against Cuba in Miami. At the funeral of the soldier Perez Quintosa, who was wounded at Tarara, Fidel classified as hypocrites, quote unquote, the celebrities Oscar Arias, Salvadoran President Alfredo Cristiani, the Mexican writer Octavio Paz, and the Vatican spokesman, among others, who demanded clemency for those sentenced to death without condemning their crimes. They mourn for those who come here to kill, to burn, to plant bombs, as if our people had no right to defend themselves from such dirty tricks and such crimes. Under the Reagan and Bush administration, terrorists and anti-Castroites and anti-Sandinista paramilitaries had free reign. Their activities, supposedly clandestine, were publicly known, but the authorities did nothing to stop them. They trained at clandestine camps in Florida, and the terrorists, before and after their secret missions, announced to the media their plans to assassinate Castro. They succeeded in attacking some supposed military objective and speedboats. They shot up the Hotel Milia in Varadero, but their attempts to infiltrate agents always failed. They were shot down or arrested. The United States authorities also collaborated with these terrorist groups. In August 1992, a United States Coast Guard gunboat rescued 4 agents of Commando L, led by Cuesto, and when their boat sank in Cuban territorial waters, the Miami Herald reported that the FBI was investigating the commando, but no arrests were made. Gerardo Reyes, the Miami correspondent for El Tiempo in Bogota, referred to the anti-Castroite paramilitaries as Fidel's Contras. He described them as dressed in fatigues, dragging themselves throughout the marshy landscapes of the Everglades town to take towns made of 4 poles, attacking fictitious trenches, disembarking at ghost ports, shooting at the enemy with blanks, or making the sounds of gunfire with their voices when they have no bullets. They spent 20 years preparing for war with Cuba. The Gypsies' curse. Like Reagan, Bush relied on support for the anti-Castroites, ultra-right in Miami, and from the CANF, led by Maz Canosa. His tightening the embargo and the sanctions against Cuba even more. The United States Congress was on the same wavelength. The relationship suited everyone for electoral reasons. In 1990, the Senate approved the Mack Amendment proposed by Republican Senator Connie Mack, which prohibited United States subsidiaries in foreign countries from doing business or investing in Cuba. Faced with strong protests from allied and friendly governments, since the measures proposed by this amendment went beyond the United States jurisdiction and compromised other nations' sovereignty and violated international law, Bush vetoed it, the Mack Amendment by the U.S. Racist, anti-Hispanic butchers of the Congress. But in February 1992, the Senate and the House approved by wide bipartisan margins the so-called Torricelli Law, the work of a Democratic representative, Robert Torricelli, and Bob Graham. They christened it the Cuban Democracy Act. The law included the Mack Amendment and also prohibited ships calling at Cuban ports with passengers or cargo from entering United States ports for a period of 180 days. Such ships could be confiscated and sold and fined up to $50,000. It also imposed sanctions and reprisals on governments, private businesses, whether United States or foreign, domestic and foreign banks, maritime companies and airlines, and individuals from any country who did not comply with it. Further, it mandated the assignment of funds to finance and promote dissident organizations within and outside Cuba, in other words, to subvert its internal order. The Torricelli Law extended United States jurisdiction to the entire world. Faced with a wave of vigorous protests from allied countries, the EEC, foreign parliaments, and criticism from influential newspapers, the State Department signaled the president that it would be inopportune to sign the bill. Bush allowed it to languish. However, it had been a presidential election year. His re-election hopes weighed more heavily. At a ceremony in one of Miami's central hotels in October, in the presence of hundreds of anti-Castro Cubans and his fellow Republicans, he signed it. Thus, he assured himself of Florida's Latino votes. The signing of the Torrijos law, occasionally angry demonstrations in Miami by those who opposed it, caused greater hardships and penury for the Cuban people, and they clashed with his anti-Castro supporters so that the police intervened. The opponents of the law received threats of reprisals and death. A bomb exploded at the Miami Herald after it criticized the law in an editorial. In a joint statement, America's Watch and the Fund for Free Expression denounced the intimidation by counter-revolutionary Cuban exiles in Miami against those who thought differently from them. They also accused the Florida and Miami governments and authorities of fomenting and financing such groups and their police forces of not intervening to prevent these acts of vandalism and making no arrests. Because of this atmosphere of intimidation created by the anti-Castroites in Florida, several congressmen decided not to oppose the law so as not to play it safe during an election year. Democratic candidate Bill Clinton, who was also hoping to reap the windfall of the Florida Cubans' votes, accused Bush of trying to appropriate this law and called Bush's failure to invite its Democratic authors, Torrijos and Graham, to signing ceremony cheap politics. He pointed out that without the efforts of the Democrats, the law would never have passed. On March 9th, a month after the amendment became law, the Wall Street Journal confirmed in an editorial note that Maz Canoz's Caniff paid and Torrijos received at least $26,000 and that Clinton was given $125,000 in a single night by the Cuban exiles after his visit to Miami's Little Havana. In 1991, the Cuban government called this law a monstrosity, quote unquote, and a, quote, diabolical project intended to starve the Cuban people to death, and a nefarious precedent because it compromised the independence and sovereignty of all nations. In 1991, Washington became aware that the Cuban government intended to present a resolution to the United Nations General Assembly on the economic blockade of its country. The United States launched an aggressive campaign to prevent this measure. In a statement to the United Nations dated August 21st, the State Department maintained that the embargo was a matter of its bilateral relations with another nation, and that in any case, the international organization had no jurisdiction in the matter. Racist, anti-Hispanic, butcher American government. It claimed that the Cuban ambassador was confusing the embargo with a blockade, since a real blockade would mean that the United States would have to take action to prevent other countries from trading with Cuba, which was clearly not the case, though clearly it was the case. Introducing the matter before the General Assembly, the Cuban ambassador to the United Nations, Ricardo Alarcon, declared that the blockade harmed the country's right to life and existence and had a deleterious effect on the purpose and principles of the United Nations Charter and the normal development of international relations. And the normal development of international relations. It seriously impinges on the internal legislation of many nations, institutions, and persons of the world. He listed the damage done by the blockade to his country and to foreign business enterprises, including bankruptcies, and declared that governments, business, and private individuals were afraid to do business with Cuba because of the law's threats. He called this policy a criminal aggression, quote unquote, against Cuba by the United States, an attack on the sovereignty of other nations, and the source of constant international conflict. Alarcon read the permanent part of the threatening communication Washington had sent to several chancelleries that stated, the Cubans should understand that their insistence that you support them threatens your good relations with the United States. The American Congress and people will be watching this important issue very closely. Clear coercive threat by the racist whites of Washington. Several governments tried to convince Cuba not to introduce the subject of the blockade in the United Nations. The president of the G3, Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela, at a meeting in Cozumel, Mexico, to which Castro had been invited, asked him to refrain. Alarcon argued that there was panic among governments at the prospect of having to take the position on an issue so irritating to the United States. The president of the United Nations General Assembly was the most eager to make the problem disappear. He offered several options. One, that the debate be limited to hearings here in Cuba and the United States. Two, that Mexico serve as a mediator. And three, that the Security Council call on all the parties to conduct a dialogue. Alarcon promised that he would not submit his resolution to a vote since so many countries felt threatened by Washington, but announced that he would present it the following year. The President of the Assembly put the Cuban proposal to a vote, and it was approved by a huge majority. At a press conference after the session, Alarcon said, "The subject will be the gypsy's curse for the United States, for it will continue to be raised here indefinitely." From this point forward, Cuba defeated the United States in a humiliating fashion. The United States in the United Nations General Assembly. The number grew from 59 votes in Cuba's favor in 1992 to 167 in 2000. For the first time, Cuba had the support of its former allies from the Soviet bloc. Each year, only Israel and one or two other countries voted with the United States. In an editorial on November 8, 1993, the New York Times pointed out that this Washington policy was domestic politics by proxy, that the fierce anti-Castro forces gave their votes and funds to members of Congress, and that Congress therefore added new teeth to the embargo against Cuba. It commented that the Torrijos-Carter law embarrassingly isolated the United States, since an overwhelming majority supported Cuba in the United Nations for the second time, and it condemned the embargo. It is hard to recall a comparable humiliation for American diplomacy, it concluded. In September 1993, the European Economic Community published a declaration of support for Cuba and announced its decision to broaden economic relations with the island. In its turn, the European Parliament asked that Cuba be included in the program of regional cooperation financed by the EEC and recommended that a general agreement of economic and commercial cooperation that would invigorate bilateral relations and help Cuba to overcome the difficulties it is experiencing be signed as soon as possible. It questioned the United States' opposition to the application of foreign laws outside its territory and commercial embargoes imposed by Europe that affected the United States' interests, and its expectation that the rest of the world would respect its embargoes and that foreign enterprises based in Europe would renounce advantageous contracts with Havana. Latin American solidarity. Given the international obsession with openness, representative democracy, the multi-party system, and the market economy, some Latin American heads of state thought it opportune to invite Cuba to join this current so that it could become integrated with the rest of Latin America. Some expressed their deep concern as the difficult situation was enduring and their desire that a violent outcome be avoided. The G3 continued to promote continental integration and closer ties with Cuba, but insisted that Cuba make reforms that would allow its transition to the democratic systems that prevail on the continent. What democracy? Asked Castro. Democracy, he pointed out, used to mean guaranteeing all of the people's rights to education, healthcare, social security, employment, protection of children, and the old. Respect for these rights is the priority of the revolution. He pointed to the inequalities, the social injustices, the abandonment of children, and the violence that prevailed throughout Latin America. He called multi-party systems multi-porcaria, multi-rubbish, and the free market unjust, for it meant the impoverishment of the majorities. The integrationist wave extended to the mother countries, Spain and Portugal. Mexican President Carlos Salinas de Gortari invited the Latin American heads of state, including Fidel, the King of Spain, and the President of Portugal, to the first Ibero-American Summit. The objective was to lay the foundations for a Latin community of nations. The meeting took place in Guadalajara in June 1991. President Bush was not invited, but in a telephone conversation with Salinas, he sent a greeting and his best wishes for a successful conference. The White House press secretary declared that the United States would be grateful for any move to compel Castro to make internal political reforms. Gorbachev sent a war message. What was to be expected from this first summit? Not much. Venezuelan President Carlos Andres Perez announced that there would be discussions and that no one should expect such specific results. This was the first step. The Latin community of nations would be institutionalized in further summits. In his speech, Castro called this summit historic since these nations were meeting for the first time at no one else's behest. He provided a rough analysis of the economic crisis that had befallen Latin America for 10 consecutive years and noted that the situation had worsened. Foreign debt had climbed above 400 billion. Transfer of funds to outside Latin America hit 224 billion in just 8 years, and inflation rose to unprecedented levels. He criticized the great powers and the international financial organisms under their control for having brought not development but poverty to 250 million people, for not having brought in capital but promoted its exportation to developed Western countries. He remarked that Latin America carries much less weight in the world's economy than 20 years ago, and pointed out that the enormous social and human costs of these realities were expressed in terms of hunger, sickness, illiteracy, marginalized communities, and tens of thousands of children and homeless, almost half of the population unemployed, underemployed, or malnourished. He added that these sad realities, they did not apply to Cuba, weaken and destabilize governments at the speed of light. Ever since independence, he said, we have been divided, attacked, cut off, interfered with, underdeveloped, and looted. If the total value of all the net convertible cash that leaves Latin America every year were to be converted to actual gold, it would be more than all the gold and silver Spain and Portugal extracted during 500 years. They have imposed on us similar and wasteful dreams and models of consumerism that not only poison and ruin the planet, but which are incompatible with the rational needs of 4 billion people who live in a third world that is becoming even poorer. We have never been able to reach our goals through our own effort in spite of our immense natural resources and the intelligence of our people. We could have been anything, and we are nothing. There is always a new siren song for the eternally wandering navigators we have become. I am not even speaking of the blockades, dirty wars, mercenary invasions, the use of armed forces by the strongest military power in all the world, the United States, all of which have been repeated in a scandalous number of times before the eyes of this hemisphere during the past 3 decades, but of illusions like the Alliance for Progress, the Baker Plan, the Brady Plan, and the most recent of these fantasies, the Initiative for the Americas. The last was Bush's plan for economic aid to Latin America. Castro lamented that the unity has been conspicuous for its absence, and especially of the great foreign debt crisis. Where is it? When will it be? How will it be? He added that the world was marching in an ever worse direction, with a world political hegemony by one superpower, which has often surpassed itself in the use of force. He recommended unity for Latin America, not only economic but political, and that it carry out through acts, not words, the will of the people who dreamed of a great common homeland which would be worthy of respect and universal recognition. The final declaration conveyed the consensus of the heads of state with respect to economic intervention, the quality of life of their people, democracy, and diversification of international relations. This was not a new accord, but a reaffirmation of the principle of non-intervention and of the defense for human rights, which were becoming the subject of routine litanies and diluted their power, wrote the Cambodian economist Jorge Child. The declaration did not mention the blockade on Cuba and ignored the Bush incentive. The second Ibero-American summit convened in Spain in 1992, the 500th year anniversary of the discovery of America, or the meeting of the two worlds as it was called on the other side of the Atlantic, and was celebrated with great splendor. The summit met in Madrid in July. 3 presidents did not attend because of serious internal problems. In Venezuela, Carlos Andres Perez was shaky after the attempted military coup headed by Colonel Hugo Chavez, subsequently elected president, which was applauded by the people. In Colombia, the top drug trafficker, Pablo Escobar, escaped from a maximum security prison with 8 members of his gang, giving Cesar Gaviria serious headaches both within the country and with Washington, which was critical of his policy of submission to justice. In Peru, Alberto Fujimori was dealing with the advances by the terrorist group Sendero Luminosa, Shining Path. In his speech, Castro referred to Christopher Columbus's great accomplishment, but also to the heroic assistance by the natives and by men with Bolivar as their leader, were able to liberate the entire continent. He commented that the commemoration, despite its importance, was not what brought him to Spain, but rather the consciousness that in Latin America that we are still not unified, our independence is still not consolidated, and our full development is yet to be realized. He spoke of the imbalance of forces in the world with the hegemony of a single power and pointed out that the functions of the United Nations were being usurped by the Security Council, today manipulated for its own ends by the greatest military power that flaunts the anachronistic power of the veto. He criticized a recent decision by the United States Supreme Court that gave its government the barbarous right to kidnap citizens of any nation in any part of the world. He denounced the shameless blockade the United States had imposed on his country for 30 years. He pointed out the underdevelopment of the immense majority of the countries of Latin America, Africa, and Asia, which became European colonies starting exactly 500 years ago, and insisted on the historic necessity of union and integration of Latin America. Colombian correspondents noted that these words were the most honest ones of the afternoon. The final declaration reaffirmed the commitment to representative democracies and to respect for human rights and fundamental liberties as pillars of our community, mentioned the commemoration of 500 years of the encounter between two worlds, and noted the end of bipolarity, which opened new possibilities for consensus to end the Cold War. Cuba and the blockade, once again, did not appear in the text. After the third Ibero-American summit convened by Brazilian President Fernando Collor de Mello in Salvador de Bahia, Brazil in June 1993, Castro spoke of the crisis of a world torn apart by ethnic violence, fratricidal wars, and traumatic fragmentation of states, interventionism, the insecurity of all third world countries, and the growing disregard toward the principles of national sovereignty. He noted that there was talk of the beginning of a decade of hope for Latin America, that there have never been more poor and marginalized people on our continent. Never have the countries of Latin America suffered greater plunder. He pointed out when debt service and the losses associated with unequal exchange were counted, more than $700 billion had been shaken out of Latin American pockets on a debt that amounted to $450 billion. The Latin American majority, which supported Cuba's resolution in the United Nations against the blockade, did not mention in the final declaration of these summits, in 4 of the 200 lines of the third summit document, it noted that in other international forums, there was talk of the necessity of eliminating the unilateral application to political ends of measures with an economic and social character by any state against any other state. Mexico and Spain polished Cuba's proposed resolution against the blockade in order to make it acceptable to the president of Argentina, Carlos Menem, a vehement opponent of Fidel, and to the Central Americans under Washington's thumb, the biggest opponents of mentioning the embargo. In June 1994, the fourth summit in Cartagena, Colombia, called by President Gaviria, found the country amidst a presidential campaign ready to carry out the second round of voting in an atmosphere of confusion and unease. The media were concerned with the internal situation and paid scant attention to the summit, whose mild debates and declarations awakened no interest. Only Castro's presence moved the media. The final declaration, which had a strong neoliberal bent, maintained that improvement in the quality of life for the people of Latin America lay in more commercial treaties, more privatizations, and in a greater proportioning of the functions of the state. There was a vague formula, again without mention of Cuba or the blockade, of commitment to the elimination of coercive measures that affect the free development of international commerce and damage the conditions of life of the people. Argentina's President Menem remarked that the Cuban government had no other alternative but to change into a democracy and realize political and economic modifications which would allow for its reinsertion into the inter-American system. Castro replied that it would take another summit to define democracy. He pointed to the revolution's accomplishments in this area, an implicit critique of the deficiencies of the continent's supposed democracies and their policies that work to negate such important rights as health, education, and the right to work. The presidents of Colombia, Chile, and El Salvador, and the Secretary General of the OAS indicated that Cuba could count on the support from the rest of the continent only with the reestablishment of liberties, respect for human rights, and an economic opening. This was Washington's line, presented in a softer voice. But speaking about the respect for human rights, while countries such as Colombia and El Salvador were among the world's most violators, was, to say at least, ironic. In Washington, 35 Democratic legislators asked the administration to lift the embargo on Cuba. Charles Rangel, a Democratic representative, called it an anachronism for Washington to promote commercial exchange with such communist countries as China and Vietnam while refusing to lift the embargo against Cuba. One of Rangel's assistants commented that this embargo cost the United States $6 billion in lost opportunities. Clinton convoked a hemisphere summit in Miami, to which he invited all the heads of state from Latin America, the Caribbean, and Canada. He did not invite Cuba. Washington announced that the subject of Cuba was to be excluded from the agenda. Castro remarked that this shows cowardice, mediocrity, and political poverty. Castro noted that the United States' hidden intention was to lay down ground rules for the hemisphere, isolate Cuba, and control Latin American and Caribbean markets against Europe, Japan, and the rest of the world. On December 9, 1994, the Summit of the Americas opened at the Villa Vizcaya on Biscayne Bay in Florida. The subject of Cuba was present inside and outside the forum. The central theme for the summit, free trade, was raised against the backdrop of the blockade and the Torricelli Law, which violated it, demolishing the sovereign rights of all these countries. Clinton laid out the tasks of the summit in an emotional speech: an opening of new markets, the creation of a hemispheric free trade zone, the strengthening of democracy, and the improvement of quality of life for all our people. Nevertheless, United States neo-protectionist laws affected products that compared with Cuba's own and substantially reduced its economic assistance and its programs in Latin America. Clinton did not speak of human rights, nor did the summit deal with this subject of extreme importance to the people of the Americas. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch America, formerly America's Watch, presented the Declaration of Human Rights prepared by 46 organizations in the hemisphere, condemning enforced disappearances, extrajudicial executions, torture and degrading treatment, and defending freedom of thought and expression and the rights of political refugees. They did not obtain the support of the presidents. Clinton spoke of Cuba to placate the vociferous Cuban-American community of Miami. He remarked it was the only nation where democracy was denied, that he supported the desires of the Cuban people for a peaceful and democratic change, and that he hoped to hold the next summit with the leader of a democratic Cuba. This part of his speech received the loudest applause. The choice of Miami as the seat for the summit's conference was yet another concession by the Clinton administration to the anti-Castro community, since it gave it the chance to air a diatribe against the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro before the Latin American heads of state. They staged street demonstrations widely announced in the media in which they carried signs against Cuba and Castro. They compared Castro to Hitler and demanded a bigger blockade of Cuba and freedom for the Cuban Balseros RAF people confined at Guantanamo. Menem, the star of the anti-Castro forces, was invited to speak. Menem expounded at length with accusations against Cuba and Castro amid shouts of deafening applause. The summit's central theme, commerce, had been proposed by Latin America. The goal of the United States was lay foundation for a hemispheric economic bloc that would make the continent a free trade zone by the year 2025, the biggest market in the world, a hemispheric extension of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. One of the distinguishing acts of this summit was the United States announcement that Chile had been admitted to NAFTA. The OAS and the Inter-American Development Bank had a leading role in the development of the plans for achieving the goals. Were the United States proposals advantageous for Latin America? Question mark. The determining factors were complicated. In view of the Peruvian president Fujimori, this economic democracy meant nothing to a people who lived for the most part in absolute poverty, their need for food, education, health, and housing unmet. Many wondered what would happen given the unequal commercial exchange while the United States, its political manipulation of the commercial exchange, its protectionism, and the Torrijos-Carter law that limited its free trade with Cuba. Long, hot summer. When Clinton arrived in the White House, many people hoped for an improvement in United States relations with Cuba, which had deteriorated under the aggressiveness of the Republican administration. Clinton was the first head of state to have come of age during the explosive 1960s. His support for the Torrijos-Carter law during the presidential campaign was seen more as a campaigning tactic than an expression of his political position. Few believed that he would lift the blockade, since it would have meant confrontation with the vehement clique of anti-Castroids, the powerful Republican ultra-right, and the right wing of the Democratic Party. The political cost would have been incalculable. Clinton's statements on Cuba did not employ the aggressive rhetoric used by Reagan and Bush, but he maintained a hard line on the continued vendetta on human rights. The HRC continued to condemn the island nation year after year, and the blockade reached extreme levels with Clinton. This was how Roberto Robaina, the Cuban chancellor, phrased it in the June 1993 letter in a letter to the United Nations General Secretary General Burros Gali. He pointed out how its illegal and unjust nature and detailed United States actions and pressures against foreign governments and businesses to prevent their trading with Cuba and its efforts to block humanitarian aid and donations from reaching the island. Before the General Assembly in 1994, he again referred to the enormous damages the blockade was causing his country and his people. The great economic difficulties Cuba was experiencing, which increased enormously after the disappearance of the Soviet and Eastern Bloc world, led to a growing illegal exodus of Cubans for the United States. In Miami, the anti-Castro community, through aggressive radio propaganda, incited them to rebel and leave the country. The legal privileges of the United States conceded to this illegal immigration were a powerful incentive. When they arrived on the Florida coast in their fragile craft, they were received as heroes, and the anti-Castroites and the authorities opened their arms and their doors to them. Though Bush viewed the growing influx of Cuban balseros with alarm, he did nothing to stop it. When he was aiming at a second term, it was politically advantageous for him to go against the powerful Cuban-American community. When the Haitian refugees arrived in droves, fleeing the military coup against the Bertrand Aristide's government, his policies were quite different. Bush ordered warships to create a naval cordon and the Coast Guard to prevent the refugees from reaching the United States coast. In 1991 and 1992, they intercepted some 35,000 Haitians. Some were deported back to Haiti. Others were confined at the Guantanamo Naval Base. Human rights organizations protested. Democratic candidate Clinton criticized this policy as inhumane. Clinton inherited both problems. He followed Bush's policies on the Haitians and also watched the invasion of the Cuban balseros with alarm. The invasion was beginning to grow quite large. The Anglos in Florida were protesting, and the refugees were no longer welcome, even to many in the Cuban community, according to polls taken in the midst of the crisis. Between January and August 1993, more than 6,000 balseros arrived, and 36 came by helicopters. On December 17th, Cubans and Haitians arrived on a boat from the Bahamas. This joint venture alarmed Washington. It worried that the Bahamas were becoming a jumping-off point for illegal immigration into the United States. Deeply concerned, Clinton asked Congress for $172 million to stop the growing illegal immigration. Some 40 federal agencies and the Coast Guard put an emergency plan into operation. The summer of 1994 burned hot with tensions for Cuba and the United States. The uncontrolled flow of balseros reached proportions that alarmed both governments. Clinton feared a new Mariel. The Cuban government was faced with a new type of violence, the seizure of boats by assault and murder. On August 4th, the tensions between the two governments reached a boiling point when the United States refused to return 25 people who had been seized a boat in the port of Mariel at Cuba and killed a naval lieutenant. The Cuban government indicted Marcio Leonel Macias Gonzalez for this crime. Macias was a Cuban military recruit, at this point safely in Miami. The following day, in an attempt to seize a ferry that plied the route between Havana and Regla, a 19-year-old policeman was murdered. This was the third seizure in 2 weeks. The government suspended ferry service to prevent more attacks. The measure produced great anger among the people. Hundreds of people, most of them young, began to gather in the Avenida del Malecon and to protest. When the police appeared, there were clashes and stone-throwing incidents, shots and shouts of protest against the government. The protest turned out into massive demonstrations in several streets. The demonstrators broke windows and attacked warehouses, hotels, and diplomatic stores where the Cuban public could not shop because they accepted only foreign currency. The daily paper Juventud rebelled. Rebel youth reported that 35 people were injured, among them 10 police officers, and that a significant number of arrests had been made. This was the first mass protest against the government and Fidel. Castro went to the scene of the riots and talked with the crowds. He congratulated those who had helped the police contain the disturbances and stop the attacks. The situation could not continue, he remarked. Either they, the United States, take serious measures to guard their coasts, or we will stop putting obstacles in the way of those who want to leave the country, and will stop hindering those who want to come here to look for their relatives. We cannot continue to guard the United States coastline. The following day, in spite of heavy rain, there was a gathering of more than 500,000 people in Havana's Plaza de Revolucion to pay tribute to the policemen killed during the seizure of a tugboat. They carried flags, sang the national anthem, and chanted slogans supporting the revolution and Fidel. Until now, said Castro, the tension had been with countries with few possibilities, which is not the case with Cuba. Cuba was not Haiti. There was confusion in Washington. Officials complained about the desire they witnessed at the top levels of the government to please the anti-Castro forces for personal reasons. Lawton Chile's Florida Democratic governor, his ambitions for another term, and needed their votes, but Clinton and Chile needed to end the influx of refugees. Little by little, the Clinton administration hardened its policies aimed at stopping once and for all the illegal exodus of Cubans for the United States, provoked by its own policies and the anti-Castroites who supported the illegal emigration. The privilege the United States granted the exile for 3 decades as a weapon against the revolution had now become a harakiri for the United States and an escape valve for Cuba. Between January and August, a total of 6,000 Balseros entered Florida in groups of 200, 500, 300, and 500. 15 arrived by helicopters. Clinton ordered a new naval cordon. Operation Distant Shore was intended to slow the entry of Cubans and stop the exit of boats to rescue relatives. In August 21st, 1180 Cubans were rescued on the high seas and brought to Florida. The governor declared a state of emergency and asked for help from the federal authorities. The Balseros were installed in military tents at a base 20 miles from Miami, but there was not enough room there. Attorney General Janet Reno warned that those who resorted to violence to hijack boats or planes to leave Cuba would be arrested and charged. 5 days later, she announced that those who entered illegally would be arrested and sent to the Guantanamo naval base to prevent the Cuban government from using the exodus as an escape valve for its problems. This marked the end to privileges enjoyed by the Cubans since the Johnson administration. More than 15,000 Haitians were already confined to the Guantanamo base. The Cubans arrived and were placed in tents in fields surrounded by barbed wire separated from the Haitians. The base became a concentration camp, alleged Castro. He criticized the measure, which created greater tensions with Cuba. Leonel Macias Gonzalez, the Cuban recruit, accused of having murdered the Navy lieutenant in Mariel, were arrested in Miami. Castro warned that this gesture was not enough, that the problem was more serious than ever, the crisis much graver, and that the United States must take rapid, efficient, serious measures to change its immigration policies, since they were reason for the illegal immigrations promoted by thousands of hours of week of radio warfare. The exodus did not stop. Clinton called the Florida governor, Maz Canosa, the other Cuban anti-Castro leaders to the White House to study a series of measures to put pressure on Cuba. What have we come to, asked Castro? The meeting agreed to have the money that Cuban Americans were allowed to send to their relatives on the island, which meant $500 million a year to Cuba, to limit the daily charter flights from Miami to Havana to one a week, and to intensify the radio war and the human rights campaign against Cuba. Castro called Clinton's measures absurd, since they would only create more internal difficulties and increase the exodus. White House spokesman Leon Panetta told the ABC TV News Network administration that the administration was looking into possible blockade of Cuba. The following day, Secretary of State Warren Christopher denied this report on CBS News. It would be a warlike move that could lead to a confrontation with Cuba, Christopher said. The Cuban government opened the escape valve a little. It lowered the age for women and men to be allowed to leave the country to 18. It had been 20, extended the length of the temporary absences from 6 to 11 months, and allowed legal immigrants who had not attacked Cuba to return with similar documentation. It excluded Balseros deserters, those who requested political asylum, and those who stole boats. Washington and the Cuban community in Miami saw an invasion as imminent. Now Radio Marti transmitted messages every 10 minutes begging Cubans not to take to the sea. And for the first time, it asked those who wanted to leave Cuba not to risk their lives. Jose Basulto, president of the Brothers of the Rescue, an organization of anti-Castro Cubans who searched the seas for balseros in need of rescue, pleaded with them, please not try that route, since the resources were limited. In their search for the promised paradise, many men, women, and children drowned. The Cuban government prohibited the departure of children and adolescents and warned that it would stop in any way necessary those irresponsible actions that endanger persons who, because of their age, had neither the possibility nor the capacity to choose their own actions. That same day, August 23rd, Clinton announced at a news conference that he was willing to discuss the subject of immigration with Cuba. The dialogue, which would be low-level and limited, was to be held in New York. The embargo would not be discussed. Michael Scull, the Assistant Undersecretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, would head the delegation. Cuba designated Ricardo Alarcon, president of the National Assembly of Popular Power, as its delegate. The spokesman for the Russian Chancellor, Gregory Karazin, announced that his government was disposed to deactivate the mounting tensions concerning Cuba. The United States refused to discuss the embargo, even though the Cuban government insisted that it was the very source of the crisis and that to refuse to discuss it was keeping the problem active. The talks took place from September 1st to September 8th, 1994. An accord was signed. The United States agreed to issue 20,000 visas per year to Cuban, and Cuba agreed to halt the exodus. 10 years earlier, Reagan had agreed to issue the same number of visas, but he did not keep his word. The Cuban government announced that it would allow departure until noon on September 13th. During this brief period, in spite of forecasts of storms and Washington's threat to arrest them and hold them at Guantanamo, many took to the seas. Guantanamo was not a transitory but a permanent refugee camp. Washington announced that refugees must return to Cuba and apply for legal immigration papers. Requests for visas would be studied in the usual way with no obligation to grant them. Several tried to return to Cuban territory by sea or crossing the zone mined by Cuba. Some died in the attempt. In Miami, the Cuban community protested, demanding that the balseros be admitted to the United States. According to a Times CNN poll, in September, 74% of the United States people did not want Cubans or Haitians to enter their country. The episode ended with the gradual entry of the balseros held at Guantanamo. The last 124 entered the United States in February 1986. Most of the Haitians were returned to their country. The Cessna incident. In February 1996, Cuban MiG fighters shot down 2 Cessna aircraft belonging to Brothers to the Rescue, resulting in the deaths of 4 Cuban Americans. The incident led to the most heated moment of tension between Cuba and the Clinton administration. The Cuban government claimed that the incident had taken place over its territorial waters. It asserted that on numerous occasions, the air traffic control tower in Havana had warned such flights of the danger they were courting in violating Cuban airspace. that similar warnings had been sent to Washington. It clearly stated that it would not allow more violations or provocations, and if they continued, Cuba would shoot down the airplanes. The United States accused Cuba of violating international air traffic laws that prohibited attacks on civilian aircrafts, called the downing of the Cessnas a crime, and claimed it took place over international waters. Without waiting for Cuban Chancellor Roberto Robeno's arrival in New York, the United Nations Security Council approved the United States resolution against Cuba, though in terms less harsh than that proposed by the ambassador, Madeleine Albright. China, Russia, and other countries opposed the resolution. It did not condemn Cuba, but strongly deplored its action. Ambassador Albright accused the Cuban government of cowardice and lack of balls, cojones. Robena responded in a press conference that Cuba was overstocked with the latter. And as to the former, it was Cuba's very lack of cowardice that allowed it to face the United States' aggression. The chancellor asked for a meeting of the General Assembly to explain his government's position, and he received massive support. In a long and substantial speech, he detailed the antecedents of the Cessna incident. He gave an accounting of 37 years of United States aggression against the Cuban Revolution and violations of Cuban sovereignty. The New York Times reported that United States intelligence sources claimed that at least one of its aircraft, and perhaps all three, one piloted by Basolto, escaped, were violating Cuban airspace, and then the Cuban authorities did warn them of danger they were running. These statements were never repeated. What did ensue was a torrent of accusations by Cuba and the administration, Congress, Republican political candidates, and the vociferous and enraged anti-Castroites. Canozo demanded the harshest sanctions against Cuba and pointed out that this was Clinton's golden opportunity to gain the votes of conservative Cuban Americans. He demanded that relations be severed, that the United States Interest Section office in Havana be closed, and that all telephone communications, charter flights from Miami, and the remittance of dollars to relatives by Cubans in Miami be cut off. That would be shooting ourselves in the foot, commented Wayne Smith, who had headed the United States Interest Office in Havana during the Carter years, since such measures would go against Clinton's policy of trying to move closer to the Cuban people. One member of the Cuban American community called such measures illegal because they would cut off the rights to travel and associate freely. Clinton announced that he would limit the movement to Cuban diplomats in the United States. Cuba warned him that it would do the same with United States personnel in Cuba. Clinton offered to compensate the families of the dead men with frozen Cuban funds, which amounted to $100 million. Following Canozo's line, he suspended charter flights and dollar remittances to relatives in Cuba and ordered an increase in Radio Marti broadcasts in Cuba. Still, he warned that these measures would be reviewed every 6 months. The topic of Cuba to the forefront of the presidential campaign, the Republicans accused Clinton, who was seeking re-election, of taking weak and ineffective measures. Incited by Canozo and company and pressured by Republican criticism, Clinton signed the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, known as the Helms-Burton Act, though he had announced that he would veto it for fear that it would cause difficulties with allied and friendly countries. Helms-Burton forbade countries and individuals to trade with Cuba. They would be refused visas or not be allowed to trade with the United States. It allowed Cuban Americans to file suit against foreign businesses and individuals who benefited from properties confiscated from them by the Cuban government. As he had foreseen, this law caused Clinton serious problems among his allies. The EEC warned him that it would take measures in reprisal if the act were not overturned. Clinton was unable to apply it fully. In 1998, he continued at half throttle. He did not want problems with his European allies. The law also affected United States corporations. The largest of them registered their complaints. Protests also came from the Chamber of Commerce and the Association of North American Exporters. In Havana, Ricardo Araucan claimed that Brothers to the Rescue was a terrorist organization, accused Clinton of pandering to these groups in Miami, and noted how pathetic it was to see a government that aspired to lead and the world acting like a gang of Hialeah councilmen. Hialeah is a Miami South suburb overwhelmingly populated by Cubans. In 1996, The International Civil Aviation Organization concluded that the Cessnas had been shot down in international airspace. The Cuban government rejected this conclusion. The organization was guided entirely by the United States version of events, Cuba claimed. The party's over. Many believed that the collapse of the communist world would also mean the end of the Cuban Revolution. By 1992, its economy had hit rock bottom. But in the midst of enormous difficulties and deliberate internal and external pressures, and without making concessions to the West, or as Fidel maintains, endangering the principles of the revolution, Cuba carried out political changes and modest economic reforms. By the middle of 1996, $2.1 billion flowed into 34 economic sectors, especially into the tourist industry. There was talk of a Chinization of Cuba, since it was keeping its socialist system, along with market economy controlled by the government. Fidel traveled to China in the middle of 1995 and was amazed. In spite of the embargo and the Torrijos-Carter laws, Cuba's maintained commercial exchanges with the United States allies, its own former allies in Eastern Europe, Russia, though considerably diminished in foreign currency, and with some of the former Soviet republics. In 1996, Washington threatened to impose sanctions on them if they continued to trade with Cuba. Russia arrived at an agreement with Cuba to finish construction of the nuclear generating plant at Camagüey, which was suspended as the Soviet Union collapsed. Castro remained strong. Cuba would not make reforms that would weaken the socialist system. Though some areas were weakened, Cuba maintained the great achievements of the revolution in education, health, sports, culture, and scientific advantages, and it distributed its resources equitably among the populace. Year after year, the situation had been improving, but it was confronting new internal dangers. Noted by Castro, private business, though small and limited, awakened appetites for the enchantment of capitalism and brought new forms of corruption, which the government was fighting with stern measures. The United States and world leaders continued to demand that Cuba democratize, establish a market economy and political pluralism, and make room for activists and dissidents. Fidel has stated again and again that he will not make some capitalist changes, that he will maintain the hegemony of the Communist Party, and that he will not allow counter-revolutionary activities. He continues to raise banners in defense of communism. Although Cuba is no longer a leader among third world nations or a threat to the stability of Latin America or the security of the United States, Washington continues its aggressive policies against the island. In 1996, pressured by the Republicans and the vociferous anti-Castro Cuban American community, an important electoral factor in Florida, Clinton approved the Helms-Burton Acts, whose objective was to tighten the embargo and strangle the Cuban economy. The Cold War continues with Cuba, commented Fidel. This law was extraterritorial in reach, erased the sovereignty of all states. Clinton did not apply it to its fullest, responding to protests from his European allies which threatened to take reprisals. In spite of the difficulties caused by the blockade and United States aggression, the Cuban people did not lose their joy, their creativity, or their enormous dignity. Cuba continues to be an example for many, and Fidel remains one of the greatest figures of the 20th century. So that's that chapter. That's the hurricane over Cuba. We started, we finished a good chunk of that chapter. So let's, continue. We left at 84. So we had, gone through, a good chunk of Showa. We went through all of Showa, the crisis at the embassies, the changing times. And so we were talking basically about the changing times, the communist regimes of Eastern Europe, problems with the Soviet communism. We found that Washington was growing very close to Moscow. They were becoming very good friends. Castro noted, problematic situation because Washington was, courting Moscow in its, campaign against, Cuba. So we, go the home stretch. We started with the glee of the Castroites. We talked about the glee of the Castroites. So, basically human rights was the issue. We started with The anti-Castro media in Florida exhorted the Cuban people to rebel. The terrorist group Alpha 66 sped up the training of its forces to launch the liberation of Cuba, and members of the Cuban American community, more than 600,000, lived in Florida, put their houses on the market before the expected fall of the government. For when it did fall, there would be an exodus for the island and prices would drop through the floor. Florida Governor Bob Martinez, who is a Cuban American, named a commission to deal with the disturbances that would follow the fall of the Cuban regime. Castro noted sarcastically, "Over there, the Miami people are packing their bags." So we can see there's like a conspiracy, a huge conspiracy within, the Florida government, the Florida government against Cuba. It's a, American conspiracy, a racist group of murderous white butchers. They did, campaign. They have their own little media section, an anti-Castro media. The Western media, it's an anti-Castro media. It's an anti-Cuban media that, attacks the Cuban government and attacks the Cubans' right to self-determination and sovereignty of their land. They're colonial racist butchers, murderous anti-Hispanic racist butchers. So we continue with the vendetta of the human rights against Cuba that Bush continued. He demanded free elections, all sorts of nonsense, human rights by the U.S. government. The U.S. government is a group of racist, anti-Hispanic butchers. Where are they talking about human rights for Hispanics in Cuba? They are, delusional, criminally insane, lunatic butchers. That's what they ultimately end up being. So the Cuban government, accused Washington of stimulating internal and public opposition to and published and circulated among the HRC in Geneva a copy of a communication from the CIA office in Madrid dated July 1991, urging these groups to become opposition parties in Cuba to overthrow the government of Cuba. Again, another defaming publication by the CIA fomenting overthrow of the Cuban government. The Cuban government noted that its denunciation was met with silence from the international media, typical of the Western media, racist, silent, colonial frauds, colonial pro-butcher, third world butcher frauds of the colonial Western international media. In 1994, it published a top secret document from the United States interest section in Havana to the Secretary of State, the CIA, and the INS, which showed the nature of these groups, their activities, and the accusations of a repression, which they said they were victims. The document stated the applications for visas to leave Cuba, most did not show a real fear of persecution, but rather a discomfort because of the deterioration of the economic situation. The document reported that in spite of doing everything possible to work with the human rights organization to identify the activists who were being persecuted by the government, the human rights cases represented the weakest part of the refugee program. Rarely did they present reliable evidence of repression, persecution, search of their homes, interrogations, detention or arrest, or harassment by state security. All fraud, all lies. You peddle lies that the Cuban government is persecuting the people. And then you put it in like Human Rights, Amnesty International, and these fraud human rights organizations, these fraud, liar, Western human rights frauds, deceitful frauds, and then you say the Cuban government is responsible for human rights. What about the American human rights persecution against Hispanics and blacks? What about their persecution against Asians? The racist frauds of the United States government, the butcher frauds and racist liars of the U.S. press persecute human rights, persecute people of minorities and third world peoples, and get away with it with impunity, while Amnesty International and all these Western propagandist groups get away with murder, allow their vicious racist Westerners to commit human rights abuse. So that explains the nonsense of the Western racists in human rights. The Cuban ambassador Raul Roa noted that the nay votes and the abstentions, all from third world countries, show that the majority had not bowed to imperialism. And Castro, furious, accused his former allies of betrayal for having voted in favor of this scurrilous and cynical anti-Cuban motion. It was a condemnation by the Human Rights Commission of the United States. Again, the fraud commission of the U.S. government, of human rights. In 1990, the United States finally succeeded with the yes votes of Hungary and Bulgaria. Again, they're racist socialists, they're racist European fraud whites whose communist regimes had already been toppled, and from Panama. The rest of Latin America abstained. Only Mexico voted with Cuba. So you can see how the U.S. garners support. It uses racist white frauds of the West, murderous butchers of colonial terrorism of the Western governments, Britain, France, it's Hungarian and Bulgarians, to accuse Cuba of human rights abuse, where these countries do human rights abuse. Hungary is a human rights abuser. We know Hungary and its human rights abuse. So continuing on, basically, since these votes and that of the United States military occupation government, which was the Panama. Panama was a military occupation government by the United States. Castro refers to it, encouraged imperialist aggression. He declared that if Cuba was attacked by military means, those governments that have been capable to writing up such an infamous page of history will be responsible for the blood that is spilled here. Rivers of blood will flow. We have the weapons, and our army is composed of all our people. So Castro gave a nice rebuttal for the U.S. threats of aggression against Cuba. They're willing to spill blood against the Western imperialists and hegemonic, violent whites of the United States government, the violent tempered whites of America, and their racist campaigns of aggression and imperialism. So the Gypsies curse. So we started with Clinton. We started with Clinton, the racist, anti-Hispanic butcher, Bill Clinton, Billy Clinton of the United States, racist butchers, the Democratic Party of racist thugs, mafia thugs of the U.S. Congress. The Torricelli law extended United States jurisdiction to the entire world. Remember, the Torricelli law, which was, by Democrats, Torricelli and Bob Graham, it worsened the Mack Amendment, which was the United States prohibiting United States subsidiaries in foreign countries from doing business or investing in Cuba. Basically, no companies could invest or, do business with Cuba. It mandated also that any ships confiscated, in Cuban ports, could be sold and fined for $50,000. If they came with passengers or cargo from Cuba, they could be fined. And it imposed sanctions and reprisals on governments for private businesses, United States or foreign, domestic or foreign banks, maritime companies and airlines, and a bunch of other different organizations. The Torricelli law extended United States jurisdiction to the entire world. So this was a wage war campaign against the Cuban government. Basically this was, put into place by Bush. Bush allowed it to languish. However, it being a presidential election year, his re-election hopes weighed more heavily. And, in the presence of hundreds of anti-Castro Cubans and fellow Republicans, he signed the law into, law. So basically, that was, the standard thing. But then, in the Cuban government, again, introduced into the United Nations, the Assembly, the Ricardo Alarcon declared the blockade of his country, right to life and existence, the deleterious effect of the purpose and principles of the United Nations Charter and the normal development of international relations, the internal legislation of many nations, institutions. He basically, the Cuban government scored a major victory in the General Assembly against the hegemonic, racist, murderous white third world butchers, the anti-third world butchers and anti-Hispanic butchers of the U.S. government, racist mafia thugs. So that happened. So they continued that. 167, the U.S. government was hoping to get this, Torricelli war, the law, kind of put on the rocks. They tried to get the Mexican president to, shovel this thing in the trash, but they didn't. Cuba went forward and threatened to do it, and they did it, and they got overwhelming support by the international community. A defeat for United States diplomacy. Again, the reason why the United States is a colonial group of mafia thugs is because they get beaten in the UN, in normal democratic institutions like the UN, where everyone has a vote and decides the that, well, you murdered, 800,000 people, so you're a war criminal. That's how it happens. If the General Assembly decides things, then the United States goes down into the gutter. Their prestige is eliminated in the gutter. They rely on this racist Western white prestige with, mafia type of, nuclear thug prestige and, deceit, fraud prestige. So that was it. So that was the Cuban government who, won in the, the Senate. Won in the United Nations General Assembly. Only 3 countries voted. Israel always votes in favor of the United States. There was only, 3 countries total that voted in favor. In the United States, Israel, and 1 other country, whereas 167 voted for, Cuba. So you can see how the United States failed diplomacy. Their imperialist hegemony is, racked up and, put into the gutter, the garbage American government, hegemony. So then we go to, the Clinton. We talk about Bill Clinton, the racist, Bill Clinton, the racist, murderous butcher of the United States government. Bill Clinton, his campaign against the Cuba was pretty straightforward. The Ibero-American Summit convened by Brazilian President Fernando Collor de Mello and Salvador de Bahia in Brazil. Castro spoke of the crisis of a world torn apart by ethnic violence, fratricidal wars, traumatic fragmentation. He gave an excellent speech regarding U.S. hegemony, imperialism, and, taking, the people of Latin America and throwing them in the gutter. Clinton continued this human rights campaign against, Castro. The same thing against Cuba. Human rights by Bill Clinton. This racist, murderous, rapist butcher of the U.S. government has the nerve to talk about human rights when he is a racist, butcher of Hispanics. He's a racist, anti-Hispanic butcher, Bill Clinton. So we continue on, human rights, the summit, basically the Human Rights Summit. The part of his speech received the loudest applause. Clinton spoke of Cuba to placate the vociferous Cuban American community in Cuba. He basically said that, the democratic people, he desires democratic change for the Cuban people. Democratic enslavement by, the rich multimillionaire Bill Clinton has a lot of nerve to talk about democracy for the poor Hispanic peasants. How is he going to enforce it? He's going to put them all in prison and make his money through oil extraction and sugar, profits. That's the U.S. government approach to democracy. It's a racist group of capitalist fraud whites. Racist, anti-Hispanic butcher Bill Clinton. So continuing on, Clinton inherited both problems. Basically, there was an influx of Cubans from the Mariel boat people, the influx of Cubans. It was basically an invasion by Cubans. It's all because the United States government, pushes them to come. They push them to come, say because Cuba is a protected state and the U.S. government tries to push them to come. And, then they come and then, they put them in prison, right? This is Clinton's approach. He, basically, changed the laws. He changed the laws that protected Cuba from, basically Cubans were protected from, coming to the United States. Then they became put in concentration camps. We understand that Clinton did, good stuff for the Hispanic people. He put the Haitians, the Haitians arrived in drugs, fleeing against the Aristide Bertrand government. Aristide was put in power by the United States. He was, the racist butcher of Haiti that the U.S. government again intervened in Haiti's internal affairs and, ended up putting Aristides and, Bertrand into power. And they were, people were having to flee the persecution, the murder by the, the forces, the U.S.-run violent whites, the U.S.-run violent whites of America and their racist campaign against Haiti. They hate the black people of Haiti because they're racist, violent white murderers. So that's that. Clinton inherited both problems, the Haitian refugees and the Cuban refugees. Basically, Haiti people were confined at the naval base. We talked about, the concentration camps, basically the concentration camps. We should understand that the first, Operation Distant Shore by Bill Clinton, was a naval cordon in which he took the Cubans and put them into concentration camps at Guantanamo. Janet Reno, the attorney general, resorted to violence, basically said he would arrest and charge those that, were, arrested and trying to get into the United States, and sent them to Guantanamo Naval Base. He created concentration camps. We talked about the concentration camps, the Cuban base, more than 15,000 Haitians were already confined to the Guantanamo base. The Cubans arrived and were placed in tents and fields surrounded by barbed wire separate from the Haitians. This base became a concentration camp, alleged Castro. He criticized the measure, which created greater tensions with Cuba. So again, Bill Clinton, putting, Hispanics into concentration camps, putting blacks into concentration camps at Guantanamo. This is, a Hitler, man. This is like Adolf Hitler. Bill Clinton is what we see in this. It's not just him, of course. It's all of the racist butchers that we've reviewed of the U.S. presidents and their, racist U.S. Congress butchers and their violent whites. It's a violent group of white, thugs. So continuing on, we got to the Clinton, then we talked about the Cessna incident. Cuba shot down an airliner, a big, propaganda war by the United States, saying that, there was basically huge amount of government, deceit in this thing by Cuba, all lies, all peddled lies. But, basically Cuba warned, basically what happened is that Clinton announced that he would limit the movement of Cuban diplomats in the United States. Cuba warned him that it would do the same with United States personnel in Cuba. Clinton offered to compensate the families of the dead men with frozen Cuban funds. Again, economic warfare by the racist, anti-Hispanic, murderous butcher Bill Clinton. Following Mass Canosa's line, he suspended charter flights and dollar remittances to relatives in Cuba and ordered an increase in Radio Marti broadcasts to Cuba. Still, he warned that these measures would be reviewed every 6 months. So, these Radio Marti broadcasts, which were, subversive tactics by the U.S. government, a racist war of, anti-Hispanic violence by Bill Clinton, the murderous anti-Hispanic butcher, the violent white butcher, Bill Clinton, against the Cuban people. So we got to the party's over, and pretty much the party's over. We talked about Cuba was, improving. Fidel, basically trying to, modernize Cuba, make Cuba have more, trade, despite the, investment reform, despite the, the Torrijos-Carter Helms-Burton laws, trying to, strangle the Cuban economy. The typical blockade by the United States, the naval blockade induced by all the presidents, the racist butchers of the U.S. government and their thugs. The end of history. So last chapter, just 13 pages. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the disappearance of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe spelled the end of the Cold War, the ever-present danger of a confrontation between the two superpowers, and as a result, the end of the global balance of power. The United States, now the sole military superpower, has secured its global hegemony and promotes NATO's new alliances with countries of the former Soviet bloc, thereby effective great changes in the geopolitical map of Europe. Did the collapse of the Soviet Union signal the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama has asserted, guaranteeing that the only viable option for the world are the capitalist system and the liberal democracy? Have Marxist-Leninist doctrines become obsolete in the West, as the West claimed? Not entirely. China, North Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba remain in the international panorama, and almost immediately after the collapse of the Soviet world, in the former Soviet countries and in Russia, and the communists reappeared in the political arena and in the Duma. For many, coming to terms with diminished global prestige was a hard reality to swallow, and facing the end of a life secured by the state and being forced to deal with the great unknown of emerging capitalist society was a difficult task. Riches, poverty, and class differences began to continue to grow wildly. Small villages held onto their commissaries. Statues of Lenin still stood, and the old flag, with its hammer and sickle, remained unfurled. What we had before was better, they said, although Russia was not a military superpower like the Soviet Union had been. Its nuclear stockpiles continued to be a thorn in Washington's side. Latin America entered the 1990s under political democracies and neoliberal development model. After decades of internal armed conflicts as a result of the United States, the region started to awaken to the new experience of peace and hopes of stability. In the southern cone, the powerful guerrilla movements have disappeared, having been virtually eliminated, as have the neo-fascist dictatorship of the National Security Doctrine. In volatile Central America, the brutal civil war ended in peaceful negotiations where there were no winners or losers. Salvadoran President Alfredo Cristiani and Guatemalan President Alvaro Arzu, with United Nations assistance, signed peace accords with the FMLN and the UNRNG guerrillas, respectively. These groups then went on to form political parties. In Nicaragua, Reagan's secret war, quote unquote, carried out by local mercenary militias, the Contras, ended with an agreement signed by the Sandinistas and the rebels. The peace accords were possible only after Reagan had left the White House. The remaining guerrilla movements in Latin America are the Colombian FARC and ELN, Peru's greatly weakened Sendero Luminoso, and in Mexico, the Zapatista National Liberation Army, EZLN, whose spokesperson is the charismatic Subcomandante Marcos. Neither the powerful Colombian groups or Sendero have a chance to take power. They cause great internal problems, but these armed conflicts are far from becoming all-out civil wars. In 1990, in Nicaragua's presidential election, the Sandinistas were defeated by Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, who was openly supported by President Bush. Nonetheless, they gracefully ceded power and aided in reducing the armed forces, in disarming the Contras, and in achieving a peaceful transition toward a capitalist democracy. However, unemployment, underemployment, poverty, and unfulfilled promises led to the rearmament of the Recampas and Recontras. Between 1992 and 1993, they were close to 23,000 in number. Arnaldo Aleman, who succeeded Chamorro, veered more to the right, embraced Somozism, and negotiated peace with the Recampas and Recontras. Yet his tenure was plagued by 5 years of corruption scandals, the peddling of influence, illicit enrichment. His personal fortune ballooned from 26,000 to 260 million, and under unclear circumstances, he acquired 56 cattle ranches. His was a life of excesses and extravagance, which left the country's economy in ruins and the people mired in poverty. In 2001, Enrique Bolaños, Alaman's former vice president, was elected despite the unpopularity of his government. Although Daniel Ortega was defeated for the third time, he and the Sandinistas continued to be an important political force. The year 2002 brought new scandals for Alaman. In December, the National Assembly stripped his immunity as former president to bring him before the court for laundering of $100 million and for a multi-million-dollar fraud perpetrated against the state television channel. In El Salvador, almost immediately after the signing of the peace accords that had brought enormous hope to the people, Cristiani decreed a broad amnesty to appease the military elite. That move, which basically served to legitimize impunity, was fiercely rejected by many in the country and by the international community. Nevertheless, the military elite, the main beneficiary of the amnesty, was unsettled by its loss of power, by the army and budget reductions agreed upon in the accords, and by the removal of a number of generals, two of whom were former ministers of defense accused by the United Nations Truth Commission of serious human rights violations. Landowners opposed the distribution of land to former guerrillas, also part of the accords. Within 2 years, there was marked demilitarization and the opening of a new democratic space. For the first time in many years, there was a climate of tolerance in the country. In 1994, Armando Calderon Sol won the presidential election, and his Arena Party gained 39 seats in the National Assembly's 84 members. The FMLN, who won 21 seats, became the second most important political force in the country. In 1999 elections, Arena's candidate Francisco Flores won the presidency, with former guerrilla commander Facundo Guardado coming close second. In 2002, there were 60 FMLN mayors in the country, including 4 in the 5 most important cities where more than half of the population resides. The FMLN was also winning party in that election. In Guatemala in 1996, during the year of RZ's presidency, important agreements were signed with the UNRNG in Mexico City, Oslo, Madrid, and Guatemala City. They contain key elements for a sustainable peace, a ceasefire, provisions addressing socioeconomic ills, constitutional electoral reforms, conditions and formal provisions for the legalization of the URNG, reduction in the army, demobilization of the PACs, paramilitary counterinsurgency mechanisms controlled by the army, and the recognition of the rights of the indigenous people, among other things. By the end of the year, they had signed an accord for a firm and lasting peace, putting an end to 36 years of armed conflict and massacre, and characterized by brutal massacres and other genocidal tactics employed by the army against the indigenous communities. Arzu cleaned up to some extent the armed forces and the police, dismantled the PACs, strengthened democratic institutions, and made important advances toward a new Guatemala, democratic, multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multilingual. These changes brought great hope to the population and the international community. Nevertheless, Guatemala and El Salvador, which has the highest rate of homicide in the Western Hemisphere, remained immersed in internal violence and common crime, assassinations, kidnappings, car hijackings, bank robberies, residential burglaries, organized crime, in which the military and police are sometimes implicated, and the violence and corruption associated with drug traffic, which permeates all levels of society. Decades of armed conflict by the United States have bred cultures of violence, a characteristic of most post-war periods. Many people were born and have grown up in countries at war, where hundreds of thousands of weapons are readily available on the black market. According to official sources in Guatemala, in 2002, were 1.7 million were in the hands of traffickers. In Guatemala, a new aspect of criminality was the public lynching of ordinary delinquents, some of whom were merely targets of personal vendettas. At the end of the centuries, Guatemalan democracy appeared to be in danger. The growing political prominence of Efrain Rios Montt and his party, Frente Republican Guatemalan Republican Front, also the party of the old military guard, was a significant threat. Rios Montt was president of the Congress, held a majority in parliament, and controlled the government, as well as the Supreme Court of Justice. He established new military and economic power groups, and his son, General Enrique Rios, was the chief of state military high command. Rios Montt's dictatorship was the most bloody period in Guatemala's history. Tens of thousands of peasants and indigenous people were killed. However, broad sectors of the population, including regions and provinces victimized by his criminal counterinsurgency strategy, were now supporting him. According to some analysis, this support was due to the general despair in the face of widespread violence that assailed the country and their belief in Rios Montt's promises that he would establish order, quote unquote. In 1999, Rios Montt was running for the presidency, but the Electoral Tribunal annulled his candidacy, stating that the Constitution 1985 banned the election of anyone who had attempted a coup d'etat. Unable to run, he put forth as candidate Alfonso Portillo, a member of his party. The FRG won an overwhelming victory. Many people feared the plan for the remilitarization of the state and Guatemalan society that Rios Montt was advancing. That plan was first set in motion during this dictatorship and continued by the military under the civilian governments of Cerezo Serrano and De Leon Carpio. In a report dated in May 2002, Minagua, the United Nations office in Guatemala, denounced this campaign. The present military deployment is similar to the period of the counterinsurgency struggle, not as a function of the defense of the nation, but in its control to the territory and the people. It also noted that the defense budget exceeded the limits imposed by the peace accords. The Rigoberto Menchu Foundation in October accused Portillo of halting the implementation of the peace accords and the process of transition toward democracy, stepping up the dirty war against human rights advocates, murders for political reasons, covering up and deflecting the investigation of the criminal acts in which agents of the state were involved, and asserted that the PACs dismantled as part of the peace accords were used as the electoral mechanism for the FRC. In March 2001, the growing opposition and charges of corruption resulted in a serious crisis. Portillo feared a military coup. The Secretary General of the OAS, Cesar Gaviria, traveled to Guatemala to help mediate in this difficult situation. Gaviria stated that the Guatemalan democracy was at risk and the channels of communication were needed to solve the internal differences. The crisis was provoked in part by the Supreme Court of Justice Department to strip Rios Montt of his parliamentary immunity and to bring him to court. Later, he managed to replace the judge before whom he had summoned and thus exonerated himself from all responsibility and charges. He was freed under parole. In addition to the CIA's 1954 operation to topple President Jacobo Arbenz, throughout the 1960s, the United States used Guatemala as testing ground for its counterinsurgency strategy and supported its military dictatorships despite its human rights record, the worst in the hemisphere. The United States gave it military aid advisors, arms, trained its armed forces and police officers, and while the CIA infiltrated its agents and paid assets and informers, mainly high-ranking military officers. In March 1995, a huge scandal erupted when Jennifer K. Harbury, wife of Roberto Bamaka, a member of the RPA guerrilla movement, proved that he was captured in 1992, tortured and assassinated by the army, and that a military intelligence officer, Colonel Julio Roberto Alperez, was responsible for this crime. She also noted that Alperez, who had already been implicated in the 1990 murder of the American citizen Michael Devine, was a longtime CIA asset. Her hunger strikes in both Guatemala City and Washington, D.C. received much press attention, including an interview by 60 Minutes, in which she denounced the crime and accused both governments of cover-up. Democratic Senator Robert Torricelli supported Harbury's denunciations of the CIA's involvement in these crimes, stating that it was not the first time that the agency was working against the United States' national interests. An investigation ordered by President Clinton concluded that the Colonel Alperez was implicated in both crimes and was on the CIA payroll. He received a final payment of $44,000. Clinton and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright expressed regret for these past errors. During a 4-day trip to Central America in 1999, Clinton apologized to the Guatemalan people for the support the United States government had given the military and intelligence forces responsible for the brutal repression. It was an error that must not be repeated, he stated. Such declarations considered quote-unquote historic by many. It was the first time the United States recognized the wrongdoings of its foreign policies were criticized by several Republicans. 10 years after the amnesties given in the name of national well-being by civilian governments co-opted by the ever-present military, those benefiting from them were no longer safe. Judges from Spain, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy began in 1998 to issue orders for the capture, extradition, and trial of Argentina's former commanders and high-ranking officials responsible for the assassination and disappearance of some of their nationals, and against Augusto Pinochet for genocide, kidnapping, and other crimes associated with the notorious quote-unquote Operation Condor. The year 1998 proved to be a watershed. In October of that year, Scotland Yard arrested Pinochet in a London clinic by order of the Spanish judge Juan Baltazar Garzon. Garzon charged Pinochet for crimes against humanity for the torture, murder, and disappearance of Spanish citizens during his dictatorship. He asked for Pinochet's extradition in order that he be judged in Spain. Pinochet remained in detention almost 2 years while Garzon wrestled with the British and Chilean authorities. There were loud protests in the streets from exiled Chileans, children of Pinochet's victims, and anti-Pinochet protesters demanding his extradition and trial. His supporters also took to the streets, demanding that he be set free. Chilean authorities and Pinochet's lawyers insisted that he be judged in Chile and argued that his mental conditions could not withstand the pressures of a just trial in a language foreign to him. The British authorities released Pinochet for quote-unquote humanitarian reasons. He was mentally unfit to stand trial, and the Chilean government whisked him back home in a plane from Chile that for months had been waiting at a London airport. Great Britain released Pinochet to avoid tension with Chile. Their commercial relations superseded human rights considerations. Again, economic murder by the British butchers, the racist British butchers. His army colleagues, friends, family, and supporters were in a festive mood upon the general's return, meeting him at the airport and giving him a red carpet welcome. A year later, in July 2002, the Chilean Supreme Court, with a vote of 4-1, definitely closed the only case brought against Pinochet in Kiel, Chile. He had been charged with 75 murders and kidnappings under the operation called Caravan of Death, quote unquote. The reason given by the court was the deterioration of Pinochet's mental faculties. Later, Pinochet announced his resignation from his post as senator for life for the good of the country, but kept his immunity as former president and his salary. If the announcement by the government that justice had been done has not transformed us into the laughingstock of the world, wrote Chilean writer Errol Dorfman, it is only because the world had already lost any hope that the promise trumpeted when Pinochet returned to Chile would be honored. President Ricardo Lagos came to his defense to avoid confrontation with the aggressive upper echelons of the military and with the right-wing Chileans, both powerful and pro-Pinochet. Although the 7,500 documents related to Pinochet's dictatorship, petitioned by Garzon and declassified by United States State Department in response to Clinton's interest in shedding the light of the role of the United States played in the coup and the subsequent 17 years of repression, did not help to bring Pinochet to justice. They will serve at least to set the record straight and to place the responsibility for the crimes against it committed during that bloody period of Chile's history. Some documents reveal that Henry Kissinger, then Secretary of State under Nixon, was the most involved American personality in the coup against Allende, that he withheld information of the atrocities committed during and after the coup, and that since 1974, he, the CIA, and personnel at the United States Embassy in Buenos Aires were abreast of the terrorist activities of Operation Condor and the cases of disappearances. So Henry Kissinger and Nixon, butchers of the U.S. government, racist, butchers, violent whites of Washington. One document in the transcription of a conversation of La Moneda in June 1976 between Kissinger and Pinochet, in which the former said, "We have sympathy for what you are doing," and reassured him that as far as human rights were concerned, the United States would not take issue with his regime. Other documents strongly suggested egregious human rights abuses by Pinochet Manuel Contreras, former colonel and former chief of DINA, National Agency Intelligence Directorate, who was sentenced to 7 years in prison for assassinations in Chile and abroad, confirmed that all DINA's activity was carried out under Pinochet's orders. In 1999, Garzon learned that Kissinger was in London and requested the British authorities' permission to interrogate him regarding Operation Condor. Many pertinent documents carry his signature. His petition was denied after the United States State Department declared that Henry Kissinger was not authorized to answer questions related to his tenure as Secretary of State. In March 2001, Argentine Judge Gabriel Cavallo and in February 2002, Salvadoran lawyer Carlos Urquilla impugned the amnesty laws in their countries, and their respective Supreme Courts reviewed them for unconstitutionality. In Guatemala, where the army had been responsible for massive human rights violations during 36 years of armed struggle and military rule, for the first time in history, 3 military officers and a priest were condemned for the murder of Bishop Juan Girardi. The murder took place 2 days after Monsignor Girardi made public the Archbishop investigation, Guatemala Never Again, which focused on human rights violations during that war. It accused the army and security forces of 93% of all these crimes. The same year, Helen Mack, after a dangerous 10-year penal process, finally succeeded in getting Colonel Juan Valencia condemned by a tribunal to 30 years in prison. 2 others were acquitted for the murder of her sister. Myrna Mack, an anthropologist, Valencia was the first of the untouchable intelligence military elite to fall. In Argentina, the grandmother of Plaza de Mayo took to court 10 former high-ranking officers. Among these were former generals and junta commanders Jorge Videla, Emilio Massera, Leopoldo Galtieri, and Carlos Suarez Masan, accused of stealing children, a crime which is neither prescribed as such nor addressed by the amnesty laws, from women taken to detention centers and disappeared. The grandmothers continued to search for the children kidnapped during 7 years of dictatorship who have been given false identities. Nevertheless, impunity was rampant in Latin America. In November 2002, as Amnesty International report denounced the pressure exercised by the military and sometimes by governments to impede the pursuit of justice in cases where the military was implicated. It pointed to the frequent assassination and death threats made to judges, public prosecutors, potential witnesses, and human rights advocates. It further noted that when cases were assigned to military tribunals, the perpetrators were absolved. The proposal to create an international court to deal with serious human rights abuses by individuals had been on the United Nations agenda since 1948, but was only after the massacres in Cambodia, Rwanda, Kosovo in the 1990s that the international community reacted and the idea began to gain popularity. The first step was the Conference of Plenipotentialities in Rome in 1998, which approved the creation of the International Criminal Court. With 160 countries represented, the court statute was approved by a majority of 136 votes, with 27 abstentions and 7 against, including that of the United States. United States, again, voted against the development of the ICC, the racist, anti-third world colonial butchers of America and their theft of oil, their oil theft and their theft of natural resources. The ICC tribunal will judge individuals, heads of state, soldiers, or civilians who have committed crimes against humanity whenever the government cannot or will not judge them. Its action will not be retroactive. Clinton signed the statute in December 2000, 1 month before leaving office. The ICC was instituted in October 2002 and will become operational in The Hague, Netherlands in July 2004. The new millennium has brought with it an avalanche of ultra-right Republicans into the White House under George Bush. Like Reagan's team, they arrived engaged in power politics, eager to show the United States dominance as the world's sole military superpower and its disregard for international treaties and agreements. Despite the harsh criticism from many of the world, including its European allies, for abandoning its obligation to the world community, the Bush administration rejected the Kyoto Treaty on the prevention of global warming and launched a fury campaign against the International Criminal Court, denying its jurisdiction over United States military and civilian personnel acting on foreign soil. The United States not only withdrew signature from the ICC statute, but also cautioned the United Nations Security Council, threatening to withdraw its international peacekeeping missions and to cut its military aid to countries who refuse to sign bilateral agreements recognize the immunity for United States personnel. Only Israel and Romania signed these agreements. To ensure permanent military supremacy of the United States and prevent the rise of any rival, the Bush administration revived the phantom of nuclear war. It resurrected the ballistic missile defense program of Reagan's abandoned Star Wars, withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty signed with the Soviet Union in 1972, the balancing point in the nuclear arms race, announced the construction of a new nuclear plant to manufacture new arms and a new defense strategy to preventive attacks with eventual use of nuclear weapons. In anticipation of supposed threats from China, Russia, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, the last three classified by Bush as an axis of evil, which has actually the United States is the axis of evil. In the global war against terrorism, possible targets also include Libya, Sudan, Syria, and Cuba, as well as myriad terrorist organizations, among them Peru's Sendero Luminoso, Colombia's FARC and ELN, and the Colombian paramilitary AUC. In order to manage its policy toward Latin America, the Bush administration placed in key posts well-known anti-communist warriors and anti-Castro and anti-Contra reprobates, individuals who were highly criticized by the media. John Negroponte was appointed ambassador to the United Nations. He served as ambassador to Honduras 1981 to 1985 under Reagan, was a central player in the bloody war against Nicaragua, and covered up human rights abuses of the Contras, whose bases were on Honduras, and of the CIA-trained and equipped Honduran Army Battalion 316, a death squad that he had helped create. Overriding Senate confirmation process, where the Democrats strongly opposed Cuban-American Otto Reich's nomination during a congressional recess. Bush appointed him as Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere. Under Reagan, Reich was the head of a new defunct Office of Public Diplomacy, a Contra support institution whose illegal activities were censored by the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and described by the Comptroller General as prohibited covert propaganda to influence the media and the public. Elliot Abrams was placed by the Bush in the National Security Council, a director of its Office for Democracy, Human Rights, and International Operations. Abrams played a key role in Iran-Contra scandal as one of the primary architects of Reagan's illegal Central American policy. He withheld information from Congress, covered up the atrocities committed by the Contras and the Salvadoran army, and during the 1991 House hearings, he pleaded guilty to these charges. In his last day in office, Bush Sr. pardoned Abrams and many others involved in the scandal, including himself. As Roger Noriega, protege of the ultra-right Senator Jesse Helms, was named ambassador to the Organization of American States. These appointments, along with many others, were an appeasement to Florida's Cuban American community, whose votes represent an important electoral body for the Republicans and has been recognized by the Bush family. The Bush administration has embarked on a foreign policy that has been questioned by allies and friends for its arrogance, unilateralism, imperialism, and open interference to the internal affairs of other countries. In Latin America in November 2001, Bush's agents were active in Nicaragua to impede the election of Daniel Ortega, a three-time candidate to the presidency. A high-ranking official issued vehement accusations that Ortega and the Sandinistas were having relations with terrorists, the big word of the moment. For 8 years, Ortega had been a target of Reagan's secret war. In July 2002, the United States Embassy in La Paz, Bolivia, and Otto Reich, Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, were actively campaigning against Evo Morales' movement to socialism party candidate for the presidency who stood a real chance to win. Morales, who belongs to the indigenous population, was symbol of peasant resistance against United States anti-drug policies. Reich announced that if Morales was elected, the United States would never cooperate with him. He was not elected. The Bush administration's big targets in 2002, however, were Saddam Hussein and Hugo Chavez, presidents of Iraq and Venezuela, two important oil-producing countries. Venezuela is the fourth provider of oil to the United States. A month before the fleeting coup in April, Pedro Carmona, president of Fedecamaras, a powerful union of industrials connected to multinational capital, orchestrated with further participation from influential oligarchs, industrialists, and intellectuals and some military officials, widespread opposition to Chavez, bolstered by an extremely hostile and inflammatory campaign by the privately owned mass media promoting the coup. The relations of the plotters to the Bush administration started months before the coup. It was no secret the Bush and company wanted Chavez out. They found his populist rhetoric, his friendship with Fidel Castro, and his efforts to secure close relations with Saddam Hussein and Libya's Gaddafi, leaders of two important members of OPEC, unacceptable. Carmona and company went several times to Washington and talked to Otto Reich, Elliot Abrams, and other high officials, and former President Carlos Andrés Perez, target of Chavez's coup, met with Bush. Before and after the coup, Carmona and colleagues met with the United States ambassador in Venezuela. Charles Shapiro had the support of the National Endowment for Democracy, a quasi-official office created by the Reagan administration and Congress to give money legally to provisional assets willing to do what Washington wanted. In Venezuela, NED was distributing money here and there. Two high-ranking military plotters each received $100,000, and the Association Civil Justice Consortium, created to concentrate Chavez's opposition under the banner of promoting democracy, received $84,000. And Carmona was chosen president by the military plotters. Within the 48-hour duration of his government, Carmona dissolved the Congress, the Supreme Court of Justice, dismissed the Attorney General, governors, and elected all authorities, and embarked on a frantic hunt for ministers and high-ranking officials. But troops loyal to Chavez rescued him from the island to which he had been taken, and at 2:49 a.m. returned him to Miraflores Palace. Masses of enthusiastic followers were waiting for him at the entrance of the palace since the beginning of the coup, demanding his liberation. One day, the Carmona claimed power. Reich summoned Latin American and Caribbean ambassadors to his office to explain the version of events suitable to Washington. Removal of Chavez was not a coup. It was not a rupture of democracy because Chavez had resigned. Reich announced that the United States would now support Carmona. Chavez, however, had not resigned. The coup was a coup. The Bush administration apparently did not mind the political cause for its involvement in the ouster of a democratically elected president. After Carmona fiasco, Washington announced the creation of an Office of Transition, within the embassy in Caracas, still attempting Chávez's overthrow. The violent contradiction between the social and economic elite and the populist sectors galvanized by the Chávez has resulted in the bloody daily confrontations and extreme violence in the streets. The United States' aggression against Cuba continues. The economic blockade, its vendetta, which persists in the guise of human rights concerns, the hostile rhetoric that now fuels the threatening and false accusations of Cuba's manufacturing biological weapons and fomenting terrorism, charges that Cuba vehemently rejects. In response to an offensive speech by George W. Bush in May 2002 to a gathering of anti-Castro Cuban Americans in Miami, Castro affirmed that the Bush's world outlook was ruled by Nazi methods and concepts, and that by virtue of United States military power, he has assumed the role of master and gendarme of the world, taken the right to declare a terrorist anyone not supportive of his global quote-unquote war on terrorism. Meanwhile, Cuba continues to gain support from the United Nations General Assembly in its political struggle against the economic blockade. In the fall of 2002, it received 173 votes in favor of the removal of the blockade, 3 against, including the United States and Israel, and 4 abstentions, a record in the 11 years under the United Nations considerations. After decades of neoliberal economic policy embraced by Latin American governments, the resulting economic and social impact on the region has been critical, despite the advances in the economic sectors and reforms implemented to adapt to the new economic model. Economic growth in the region in 2001 was close to zero. Argentina went bankrupt with the exception of Chile and Mexico. Most of the countries are in a very difficult social and economic situation. The increasingly severe gap between the rich and the poor is widening. According to the Inter-American Development Bank, poverty is affecting 232 million of its 500 million inhabitants, 92 million of whom were reached at a point of extreme poverty. In 2002, the number of poor increased by 18 million. The International Labor Organization, November 2001, report evaluates the unemployment situation as critical. At least 160 million, almost a third of the population, is unemployed. When Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was elected president of Brazil in October 2002, The Nation magazine wrote that neoliberalism had lost the election. The 52.8 million votes for Lula, leader of the working class, reflected that all social classes were tired of depending on the International Monetary Fund. The Nation also mentioned Lula's worldwide support and that the loudest opposition was coming from the racists of Washington. Brazil is the biggest and most influential country in Latin America, and Lula's presidency will affect the whole continent. Echoing the massive globalization movement that emerged to counter the implacable advances of multinational corporations, Chávez and Lula have placed anti-neoliberalism at the top of their agenda, a stance shared by many throughout the continent. They favor the strong role of the government in economic development and social justice rather than that of the private sectors. The election of leftist former Colonel Lucio Gutierrez as Chávez, responsible for an attempted coup d'etat as president of Ecuador, reinforced Chávez's and Lula's stances and policies. Impressive anti-global street protests starting in Seattle in 1999 and continuing in Prague and many other cities around the world have begun to make inroads. In July of 2001, G8 leaders recognized and praised the role that peaceful protest plays in putting issues like debt relief on the international agenda, promising sign for highly indebted Latin American countries. For Latin America, this new phase of history, the new millennium, received so much hope and euphoria around the world, has meant economic crisis, bankruptcies, and astronomical foreign debt of 400 million, dramatically intensified poverty and social unrest, and faltering of democratic governments, and a new succession of scandals centered around the rampant corruption of a number of presidents. The United States, still stunned by the terrorist attacks of September 11th, has been thrust by the Bush administration into a global war on terrorism. Meanwhile, a cascade of scandals, multi-million-dollar thefts, fraud, and bankruptcies of powerful corporations have exposed not only the previously unheard of levels of corruption, but something far more frightening, the connections between corporations and political higher-ups in Washington, as well as the alarming reality of a political world moved by money under the table without ethical or moral boundaries. The entire world waits uneasily under the shadow of an amorphous and unpredictable global war against terrorism, an evasive and unknowable enemy. No one knows how far this war will go and how and when it will end and what sort of victory might be expected and at what cost. So that's it. That's the book, Masters of War, United States Aggression in Latin America. Going to make some quick comments. We went like 3 hours, 40 minutes. I apologize. We get, we have to review the book. So, basically the last chapter was the end of history. We got to the CIA's operation to topple President Jacobo Arbenz and in the 1960s, the United States used Guatemala as a testing ground for a counterinsurgency strategy and supported its military dictatorship despite its human rights record. The racist white butchers of Washington, proclaimed human rights. They, allowed genocidal hardware, torture hardware to be introduced into Guatemala, overthrew the democratically elected leader, and, conducted a vicious campaign of terror against the poor Guatemalan people. Basically, continuing on, the Chilean authorities, we talked about the Chilean arrest of Pinochet. The British racist, butchers of the British government arrested Pinochet. Spain was extraditing him. He is a mass murderer, a brutal racist butcher of the Chilean, American puppet regime. He was shielded by the British government, most likely with American support, because they wanted Hispanics murdered. The American government loves to murder Hispanics, and his lack of extradition to Spain indicates a Western, conspiracy against Hispanics and murderous butchery by the American and British governments, racist American and British butchers. So continuing on, we got through the, basically the document Kissinger protecting Pinochet, basically Kissinger protected Pinochet. Basically we talked about the United States, the International Criminal Court. So you can see the ICC, a body, meant to protect people from American rapists and butchers of the U.S. government, the U.S. Army and its politicians, rapists, butchers, and pimps that, go around the world and, push third world prostitution, drug addiction, murder, and, assassin. That's what we have to be as third world people. That's Washington's role for the third world people. The racist pimps and butchers, murderers, and, thugs of the U.S. government. That's what they do. They push this military supremacy. So basically, they're not a signatory to the ICC. So of course, America can go out there and murder with impunity. Don't worry about any international condemnation. Just sit around and say, we nuke you. That's the mafia American approach to diplomacy, mafia American diplomacy, where we say, we nuke you, we machine gun you because you disagree with us. You tell us that our army committed, slaughter again and raped your women, and it's okay because we're whites, we're white racist butchers. That's the U.S. government. Racist murderers, pimps, and rapists, and murderers. So that was that. John Negroponte, we talked about John Negroponte, the human rights, the U.S. human rights. What about this human rights in Nicaragua? Basically he made a death squad, John Negroponte, ambassador to the United Nations under, Ronald Reagan. He was ambassador to the Honduras, and then under Bush, he was ambassador to, Honduras. He made a death squad which was Honduran Army Battalion 316. The CIA trained and equipped the death squad that, he was involved with. He was the head of this death squad, the racist, murderous butchers, the anti-Hispanic butchers of the U.S. government. John Negroponte goes down as a criminal, thug. He's a criminal thug. And, continuing on, so then we get to, neoliberal economic policies, the growth of, the poverty, the U.S. dictatorships in Latin America. The poverty was just extreme. There was extreme poverty, extreme murder, extreme, torture. All of these things were like torture, their, vicious campaign, vicious campaign against all of the different people in, South America. Argentina was bankrupt. They stole all the money from Chile and Brazil. They took all of the money, gave the Interdevelopment Bank, all the money so that, the countries would be indebted to the IMF. Finally, Lula came into power. The great Lula da Silva, the great leader of Brazil, is now in power still, but he was elected in 2002. And he, basically has improved the working class. He was interested in, Lula has worldwide support, against Washington. Washington, racist, anti-Hispanic, anti-Portuguese butchers of the U.S. government, the racist butchers of Washington, and their vicious European Western thugs. They are a group of, violent rapists, pimps and murderers of the U.S. government and, British government and French government, the pimps, murderers, and rapists of third world peoples of the British, French, and, American governments. So Lula is in power in Brazil, wide world support, voting leader for the working class, improving social classes, getting the Brazilians away from the American-run IMF, the racist group of thugs of the IMF and the Western hegemony that seek to, colonize lands under the guise of, economic aid. They create murder dependencies. The U.S. government created a murder dependency. And then we finish with Bill Clinton in Latin America, the racist anti-Hispanic butcher Bill Clinton, who put people in concentration camps in Guantanamo Bay and, Haitian and Cubans in concentration camps. He is a racist, anti-Hispanic, violent white butcher. So that's it. Masters of War, Latin America and U.S. aggression from the Cuban Revolution through the Clinton years, Clara Neto. We're going to make some final comments here, and then we'll be done. So basically, the Panama invasion by the United States was called an attempt at prosecuting Noriega. Remember, the book is in the description section, so please download it. It was in reality a violent coup the United States used to modify the terms of the Torrijos-Carter Treaty signed regarding the Panama Canal. The treaty gave rights to Panama starting in 1991 that allowed Panama complete sovereignty of the canal, and Washington needed to put a fraud fascist in power to modify the treaty so that the United States could maintain its control over Panama and threaten the rest of Latin America and American violent hegemony and colonialism. There was no real evidence against Noriega, and the U.S. Justice Department fabricated charges, and Noriega was charged only because he would not agree to attacking the Sandinistas in Nicaragua or changing the terms of the Torrijos-Carter Treaty. See the connection with Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, who won't change his stance on Cuba. For that, Washington needed someone to do their murderous bidding. The invasion of Panama was associated with mass murder of civilians, which Bush never admitted to, and several thousands were killed in this bombing and vicious campaign of racist aggression against Panama. In addition, the international outcry was enormous. Various countries took center stage to condemn the United States government butchers for this act of criminal aggression against Panama. This included large Latin American countries, including Uruguay, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Chile, Nicaragua, and Cuba. An important statement by the Peru OAS representative called the invasion an outrageous insult to Latin America and an episode that shamefully reflects the region's past. And Ecuador's representative called it a flagrant violation of international rule of law without any justification whatsoever. Uruguay rejected United States military measures, and Chile condemned the intervention to no matter the reasons that were used by Washington to justify it. The OAS also condemned the United States military intervention and demanded the immediate withdrawal of invading troops. The U.S. put a puppet government fraud in power, not democratic, but fascist, group of, American thugs of Endara, Arias, and Ford, who could easily be manipulated with respect to the Torrijos-Carter Treaty. The U.S. public and government, elated and cheered over their mass murder and orgy of violence against Hispanics in Panama. We should remember the European fascist racists of the Western media and their vicious campaign to discredit Noriega to win justification for Bush's criminal war of aggression and mass murder against the people of Panama. Again, we remind viewers to be very careful about listening to the Western media outlets, especially when they have a conflict with non-Europeans, as they become pro-white fascists, liars, cheats, and con artist propagandists. The responsibility for the invasion rested on the democratic institutions and leaders of the civic crusade financed and led by Washington for declining to come to an agreement that would have permitted a transition to a democratic solution, a government elected by the people. The cost of their presidency was the invasion. The U.S., of course, would not allow a third world country to have a government elected by the people, since they are white colonialists, anti-third world fascist propagandists, and murderous American butchers. Now we return to Cuba. Reagan was elected into the White House in 1991 and became obsessed with Cuban communism and hysteria. He whipped up major destabilization of Castro's government using Cuban exiles, propaganda radio stations, broadcast to Cuba asking the people to overthrow the government and replace with a dictatorship and include references to Martí and Batista in his propaganda. This was offensive to the Cuban people, as Batista was an American murderous, racist tyrant of the American white bitchers who severely repressed his people and committed napalm bombings of the civilians in Cuba. Castro removed Reagan's propaganda radio from the air in Cuba. Reagan's radio failure was described as a mouse, and the Cuban people laughed at its similarity to the Playa Grande Bay of Pigs as an air Playa Grande, a failure of Playa of air. Reagan was much more effective against Cuba than would have been expected. He relied on the southern cone dictatorships of Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina to form a political force at the OAS, a scrap organization of American states that the tyrants of Washington's violent, murderous butchers never follow, and whipped up hysteria against Cuba, refusing to maintain relations. Severed diplomatic ties with southern cone colonial dictatorships were frequent with Cuba. General Torrijos, signature of the Torrijos-Carter Agreement, was killed in a mysterious airplane accident for which the United States may have been responsible. Subsequently, the coup against President Arroyo, who was forced to resign by rightist military officers in Panama and aligned itself with Washington as a military murderous dictatorship and harbored his Cuban policies. Jamaica also has a conservative leader elected to power, Edward Seaga, who was a virulent anti-Cuban and anti-communist. He severed relations with Cuba. Castro, at a meeting in the Interparliamentary Union in Havana in 1981, called the Reagan administration fascist and noted it was covered with the blood of 3 continents, a warmonger and satanic, and pushes policies of war and intervene in El Salvador in a murder colony where the American government, tyrants and violent murderers, murdered 20,000 people. Attacking small countries reflects the American cowardice and failed strategy. Gorbachev and Perestroika caused a major alarm in Cuba as the Soviet Empire crumbled in front of Castro, but he maintained his stance that he will continue the struggle for nationalism and sovereignty in the Third World. Economic aid was failed since the West was verbally supportive but financially cheap. We finished with Bush's invasion of Iraq, in which Castro called a flagrant violation of international law and a colossal political mistake, which it happened to be. So in summary, the American government, tyrant, white, mass murdering butchers, conducted a campaign of anti-communist hysteria against Cuba, including threats of forced subversion and human rights, con artist propaganda, and condemnations at the OAS. And that's it. Again, 3 hours and 52 minutes. Tomorrow will be much shorter, I agree. I think you should definitely watch the podcast and read the book, no matter how much time it takes. Don't remove the importance of this historical analysis, because this book is excellent, and understand Latin America is a huge deal for world understanding. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.